Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Daniel Ravencrest, and I've been a park ranger for 13 years. I work the technical rescue team at Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, right around Seneca Rocks. When people get stuck on those tall rock faces or lost in the cave systems underneath, they call me. I used to work in the coal mines before this job. That's where I met my wife, Sarah. She worked the office above ground, and I'd see her every morning when I went down into the dark. We got married after 2 years, and she always worried about me going underground. "Those tunnels aren't safe, Danny," she'd say. "Promise me you'll be careful." I promised her every day for 5 years. Then one Tuesday morning, the mine roof fell in. Sarah was visiting the lower office that day, checking on some paperwork. 17 people died. Sarah was one of them. That was 3 years ago. I left the mines after that and became a park ranger. I thought maybe saving people instead of digging coal would help me sleep better. Some nights it does. Most nights, I still hear Sarah telling me to be careful. The caves under Seneca Rocks are different from mine tunnels. These are natural limestone caves that go on for miles. The Cherokee used to live in these mountains, and the old-timers around here still tell stories about the rocks. They say sometimes you can hear singing coming from inside the stone. Cherokee death songs, they call them. When the rocks sing, someone's gonna die. I never believed those stories. I'm a practical man. I know cave systems make weird sounds. Water dripping, wind blowing through passages, echoes bouncing off walls. It all sounds like music if you're not used to it. On April 15th, 1985, that all changed. The call came in around 10 in the morning. 3 experienced cavers had gone into the main cave system 2 days ago and hadn't come back out. Their names were Tom Richardson, Mike Santos, and Bobby Chen. All of them were good cavers with proper equipment. Tom had been exploring these caves for 15 years. The weather had been bad that week. Spring rains made the underground streams run high, and some of the lower passages were probably flooded. That's the most dangerous thing about cave rescue. You're always racing against water. I gathered my gear and headed to the cave entrance with my rescue team. Susan Martinez led our group. She'd been doing cave rescue longer than anyone in the state. If these 3 cavers could be found, Susan would find them. The entrance to the cave system sits at the base of the Seneca Rocks formation. Those rocks shoot up almost 900 feet into the sky, all gray limestone and sharp edges. The cave mouth looks small from outside, but once you get in there, it opens up into chambers as big as churches. We set up our command post at the entrance. Susan ran through our safety checks while I tested the radio equipment. The plan was simple. Follow the main passage until we found signs of the missing cavers, then work our way through the side passages if needed. "Weather Service says more rain tonight," Susan told me as I strapped on my helmet light. "If the water gets much higher, we'll have to pull back." I nodded and checked my rope system one more time. In cave rescue, you always use 2 ropes, one for climbing, one for safety. Sarah used to tease me about being so careful with equipment. "You check those ropes like your life depends on them," she'd say. It does. We headed into the cave at noon. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as we got past the entrance. Our lights cut through the darkness ahead, showing smooth limestone walls that went up higher than we could see. The sound of our boots on the cave floor echoed all around us. About 100 yards in, we found the first sign something was wrong. "Danny, look at this," Susan called from up ahead. I walked over to where she was kneeling by the cave wall. Her light was pointed at a pile of equipment: vest, climbing rope, carabiners, a helmet with a working headlamp still attached. All of it was arranged in a neat circle on the ground. "That's not how you drop gear," I said, crouching down beside her. "When cavers are in trouble, they drop equipment as they run or struggle." This looked like someone had carefully placed each item in a specific spot. Susan picked up the helmet and checked the name tape. "This belongs to Tom Richardson." I looked around the chamber we were in. It was about the size of a school classroom, with 3 passages leading deeper into the cave system. No signs of struggle, No footprints in the mud, nothing to show which way the cavers had gone. Tom knows these caves better than anyone, I said. He wouldn't just dump his gear like this. Susan tried her radio. Base camp, this is Rescue Team 1. We've found some equipment, but no sign of the missing cavers. We're going to check the eastern passage. The radio crackled back with static. Then, underneath the static, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like singing, faint and far away, but definitely music. Did you hear that? I asked Susan. She tilted her head, listening. Just radio interference. These caves mess with electronics. We followed the eastern passage for another 200 yards. The tunnel got narrower as we went, and the sound of water got louder. Up ahead, I could see where the passage opened into another chamber. That's when we heard it clearly. Singing. Beautiful, sad singing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound bounced off the cave walls and surrounded us. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Women's voices singing in harmony, but the words weren't in English. Susan stopped walking and held up her hand. We both stood perfectly still, listening. Cherokee, she whispered. That's Cherokee language. The singing got louder, and I felt something I'd never felt in Maine, all my years underground. The music was pulling at me. Not just my hearing, but something deeper. Like when Sarah used to hum while she cooked dinner, and I'd follow the sound to the kitchen without thinking about it. But this was stronger. Much stronger. We need to keep moving, Susan said, but her voice sounded strange. Dreamy, like she was talking in her sleep. We entered the large chamber, and our lights showed us something impossible. The cavern was huge, maybe 50 feet across and 30 feet high. In the center was an underground pool of dark water, and floating on the surface of that water was more equipment from the missing cavers. But that wasn't the impossible part. The impossible part was that the equipment was floating in perfect circles, like someone had arranged it from underneath the water. Rope coiled in spirals, helmets pointing toward the center of the pool, backpacks positioned at exact distances from each other. The singing was coming from the water. Susan, I said, but when I turned to look at her, she was walking toward the pool like she was sleepwalking. Susan! I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. She blinked and shook her head. What was I doing? You were walking toward the water. She looked at the pool, then at me, then at the pool again. The singing is so beautiful. Don't you want to get closer? I did want to get closer. More than anything, the voices in the water were singing the saddest, most beautiful song I'd ever heard. It reminded me of Sarah humming, but also of something much older, like the mountain itself was singing. We need to get out of here, I said, fighting against every instinct that told me to walk into that dark water. That's when we saw the first body. Mike Santos was floating face down about 10 feet from the shore. His safety rope was still attached to his harness, but the other end disappeared into the dark water like something had pulled him in. The singing got louder. I waded into the pool to get Mike's body, but the water was deeper than it looked. By the time I reached him, I was in up to my chest, and the cold was making my muscles cramp. That's when I felt something brush against my leg underwater. Not a fish or a rock, something soft that moved like fabric. Like clothing. I grabbed Mike under the arms and started pulling him back to shore. Susan was waiting with a rope, but she kept looking at the water like she was hypnotized. Help me get him up, I said. We dragged Mike onto the rocky shore. He'd been dead for hours. His skin was gray and cold. But there were no injuries on him. No signs of struggle. He looked peaceful, like he'd just decided to take a swim and never came back up. How did he get in the water? Susan asked. His climbing gear was dry when we found it. I was about to answer when the singing changed. The voices got higher, more urgent, and I heard words I could understand mixed in with the Cherokee. Come home, the voices sang. Come home to us. Susan stood up and started walking toward the water again. Susan, stop! I tackled her before she could reach the pool. We both went down hard on the rocky ground. Let me go, she said, fighting against me. They're calling for us. Can't you hear them? They need us. I held her down until the singing faded a little. When it did, she stopped struggling and looked around like she was waking up from a dream. What happened? She asked. The singing. It's doing something to our heads. We dragged Mike's body away from the pool and set up our emergency radio. I tried to call base camp, but all we got was static. Static that sounded like more singing. "We need to find Tom and Bobby and get out of here," I said. Susan checked her equipment. "There are 2 more passages leading out of this chamber. They probably went that way." But as we started to explore the other passages, we found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the limestone walls were marks that looked like musical notes. Not random scratches, careful, deliberate carvings that went on for hundreds of feet. "Who would carve music into cave walls?" Susan asked. I traced one of the lines with my finger. The stone was smooth, like the marks had been there for decades. Maybe the Cherokee. This could be sacred to them. We followed the musical carvings through a narrow passage that opened into another large chamber. This one was different. The walls were covered in paintings, faded images of women in traditional Cherokee dress. And in the center of the chamber was something that made me understand everything. Bones. Human bones arranged in careful patterns around a natural stone altar. Old bones, but not ancient, maybe 150 years old. "This is a burial chamber," Susan whispered. The singing started again, but this time it was right behind us. I spun around and saw her. A Cherokee woman in traditional dress, but I could see through her like she was made of mist. She was beautiful and terrible at the same time, with long black hair and eyes full of sadness. She sang directly to us, and I understood every word, even though she sang in Cherokee. "We died for love," she sang. "We died for home. We died for what was taken. Now you die with us." More figures appeared around the chamber. Dozens of Cherokee women, all translucent, all singing the same heartbreaking song. And walking toward us through the spirits was Bobby Chen. He was alive, but his eyes were blank, and he moved like he was sleepwalking. In his hand was a climbing rope tied into a noose. "Bobby," I called, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking toward a ledge at the far end of the chamber. Susan tried to run to him, but one of the spirit women moved in front of her. The ghost looked right into Susan's eyes and sang something that made Susan stop and smile, like she'd just heard the most wonderful news. "They want us to stay," Susan said in that dreamy voice. "They've been alone so long, we can keep them company forever." Bobby reached the ledge and started to put the rope around his neck. I had to choose, save Bobby or save Susan. Both of them were under the spirit's control, and the singing was getting to me too. I could feel my own thoughts getting fuzzy, my own feet wanting to walk toward the ledge. That's when I heard another voice cutting through the singing, a voice I knew better than any other. "Danny," Sarah's voice whispered in my ear. "Be careful." Sarah's voice broke the spell just long enough for me to think clearly. I ran toward Bobby and tackled him before he could jump. We both went down hard, but I managed to get the rope away from him. "Bobby, wake up!" I shook him until his eyes focused on me. "Danny? How did I? Where are we?" He looked around the chamber full of spirits and started to panic. "What are those things?" "Cherokee women. They died here." I helped him to his feet. "We need to get Susan and get out." But Susan was surrounded by the ghost women now, and they were all singing to her. She was smiling and walking slowly toward the ledge where Bobby had almost jumped. "Susan," I called, but she couldn't hear me over the singing. One of the spirits turned to me. She was older than the others, maybe a leader. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through the caves. "You know our pain," she said. "Your woman died in the dark, like we did. Join us, and you'll see her again." That hit me like a punch to the chest. "Sarah's not here, isn't she?" The spirit woman smiled. "Listen." The singing changed, and I heard Sarah's voice mixed in with the Cherokee women. She was humming the song she used to hum while cooking dinner, the song that always brought me home. "Danny," Sarah's voice called from the ledge. "I'm here. I've been waiting for you." I looked toward the ledge, and there she was. Sarah, looking exactly like she had the morning before the mine collapse. She was wearing her blue work dress and smiling at me with that smile that made everything better. "Come home, Danny," she said. "We can be together forever." Every part of me wanted to run to her. I'd spent 3 years missing her, 3 years wishing I could see her one more time. And here she was, calling me home. But something was wrong. "You're not Sarah," I said. The Sarah shape on the ledge looked hurt. "Of course I am. Who else would I be?" Sarah never called me Danny. She always called me Daniel, because she said it sounded more professional. The Sarah shape flickered, and for a moment I could see through her to the Cherokee woman underneath. "Your woman is dead," the spirit said, dropping the pretense. "We are dead. You will be dead. Death is the only way to stop the pain." "No," I said. "Sarah wouldn't want that." The spirit woman got angry. "We threw ourselves from the cliffs when the white soldiers came. We chose death over slavery. You can choose death over grief." "You chose wrong," I said. All the singing stopped at once. The silence in the cave was deafening. "What did you say?" the spirit woman hissed. "You chose wrong. Sarah died fighting to live. She was trying to help people when the mine collapsed. You gave up." The spirits started screaming, not singing, but screaming with rage and grief. The cave walls began to shake, and water started rushing into the chamber from cracks in the ceiling. "If we cannot have peace, neither can you," the lead spirit shrieked. Water was pouring in fast now. The chamber was flooding, and the only way out was through passages that would be underwater in minutes. Bobby had snapped out of the trance and was trying to reach Susan, but the spirits were holding her back with invisible hands. "I had one chance. I understand your pain," I called out over the sound of rushing water. "I lost someone I loved too, but keeping others here won't bring them back." The lead spirit turned to me. "Then what will? Remembering them, honoring them, making sure people know what happened to you. The white world forgets everything," she spat. "Not if I tell them. Not if I make them remember." The water was up to our waists now. Susan was still trapped by the spirits, and Bobby was struggling to stay afloat. "Let her go," I said. "Let us all go, and I promise I'll make sure people remember what happened here. I'll make sure they know you died defending your home." The spirit woman stared at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the rising water, at Susan and Bobby, at me. "You will remember? I will remember." She nodded slowly, and the other spirits began to fade. As they disappeared, Susan snapped out of her trance and started swimming toward us. The water stopped rising. We made it out of the caves, just as the sun was setting. Susan and Bobby were shaken but alive. We recovered Mike's body and reported the incident as a cave diving accident. The official report said nothing about Cherokee spirits or supernatural singing, but I kept my promise. I spent months researching the history of Seneca Rocks and the Cherokee people who lived there. I found records of the forced removal in the 1,830 seconds, SS, the Trail of Tears that made thousands of Cherokee leave their homes. I found stories about women who chose to die rather than leave the sacred mountains. I worked with the Cherokee Nation to put up a memorial at Seneca Rocks. It tells the real story of what happened there, and it honors the women who died defending their home. The singing stopped after that. Other cavers still explore the cave system, and nobody reports hearing voices anymore. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the rocks just right, you can hear something that might be singing. Something peaceful. Now, not sad. Susan transferred to a different park after the incident. She said the caves felt different to her now, like they were watching. Bobby still goes caving, but never alone, and never at Seneca Rocks. As for me, I lost the hearing in my left ear that day in the caves. The doctors say it's from exposure to loud sounds, but I know better. It's from listening to voices that weren't meant for the living world. I still work cave rescue, and I still think about Sarah every day. But I don't wish I could join her anymore. She died trying to help people, and now I do the same thing. That's how I honor her memory, by living, not by dying. The Cherokee women taught me something important that day. Grief is like an echo in the caves. It bounces around forever if you let it. But if you give it a way out, if you turn it into something that helps other people, it can finally find peace. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear Sarah humming again. Not calling me to join her, but encouraging me to keep going. To keep helping people. To keep living. The rocks don't sing anymore, but they remember. And so do I. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because some things are too important to forget, even if they're hard to believe. The Cherokee women of Seneca Rocks deserve to be remembered. And Sarah deserves to be remembered too. We all deserve to be remembered for how we chose to face the darkness. Remember that. The next time you hear something singing in the wind, My name is Samuel Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger for 22 years. Most folks call me Sam. I work the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, patrolling the remote wilderness areas where city people never go. It's dangerous work sometimes, but I like the quiet. I like being useful. Before I became a ranger, I spent 8 years with the ATF, that's the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I chased moonshiners and drug dealers through these same mountains, arrested over 200 criminals in my career. My grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew. See, my grandfather was a bootlegger during Prohibition, made the best corn whiskey in 3 counties, according to family stories. I chose law enforcement instead. Figured it was better to be on the right side of the law, even if it meant going against family tradition. That choice brought me to Copper Ridge in September 1987. The harvest moon hung fat and orange over the mountains, making everything look like it was covered in honey. Beautiful night for hiking, if you like that sort of thing. I was there on business. We'd gotten reports of marijuana plants growing somewhere in the wilderness. Modern criminals like to use the old moonshine sites because they were already hidden. Remote haulers where the government couldn't find them. My job was to locate the operation and call for backup. Copper Ridge sits 12 miles from the nearest road. No cell phone coverage, nothing but trees and rocks and old stories. The mountains here are steep, full of hidden valleys where a man could disappear forever. Perfect for people who don't want to be found. I'd hiked these trails before, but something felt different that night. The air was too still. Even the insects had gone quiet. My radio crackled with static, which was normal in the mountains, but this sounded almost like music. Old-timey fiddle tunes from way back when. Equipment malfunction, I told myself. Atmospheric. Pressure playing tricks. I'd been walking for 3 hours when I smelled it. Corn mash. Strong and sweet, like someone was cooking moonshine nearby. But that was impossible. Nobody had run stills in these mountains for decades. The smell had to be leftover residue from the old days, maybe stirred up by the weather. The marijuana plants were right where the tip said they'd be, in a clearing that looked man-made. Neat rows of cannabis, maybe 2 months from harvest. But something was wrong. The plants were healthy and ready, but nobody had been tending them. Weeds grew between the rows. Equipment lay scattered and abandoned. Who walks away from a profitable drug operation? I started taking pictures for evidence, using my flashlight to illuminate the scene. That's when I found the mason jars. 3 of them, sitting in a perfect line next to the marijuana plants. Old-style canning jars, the kind my grandmother used for preserves. But these held something that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Not electric light, something organic, like fireflies trapped in glass. I picked up one jar and held it close to my face. The liquid inside moved like water, but it gave off its own soft light. Moonshine doesn't glow. Nothing glows like that except... A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, hand on my service weapon. The forest stretched dark and empty in every direction, but I could feel something watching me. Something that didn't want me there. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Ranger Ironwood. You need to show yourself." Nothing answered except the wind in the trees, but the smell of corn mash got stronger, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of glass clinking together, like someone tapping mason jars with a spoon. I should have left right then. Should have marked the location and hiked back to call for backup. But I'd never walked away from anything in my life, and I wasn't about to start. The path deeper into the hollow was overgrown but still visible. Someone had walked this way recently, though the footprints in the mud looked strange. Too light, like whoever made them wasn't carrying much weight. As I followed the trail, my flashlight beam caught something white between the trees. A wooden cross, weathered and leaning. Then another. And another. I was walking through a graveyard. Most of the headstones were too old to read, worn smooth by decades of mountain weather. But a few still showed names and dates. Ironwood appeared on more than one marker. My family had been burying people in this hollow for over a century. One stone made me stop cold. Jeremiah Ironwood, 1889 to 1927, beloved father and grandfather. My grandfather, shot and killed by federal agents in 1927, according to family whispers. I'd never known exactly where he was buried. The smell of corn mash was overwhelming now, so strong I could taste it. My radio static had gotten louder too, and I could swear I heard voices mixed in with the white noise. Men talking in the distance, too far away to understand. I was starting to think this wasn't a simple drug bust anymore. The moonshine still sat in a natural depression about 50 yards past the graveyard. Not a modern operation, this was old-school mountain engineering. Copper coils and wooden barrels built to last. But it couldn't have been there long. The wood looked fresh, and there was no rust on the metal. Someone had been using this still recently. Very recently. I approached carefully, camera ready. The setup was too elaborate for a weekend hobby. This was serious production equipment, the kind that could make hundreds of gallons. But like the marijuana operation, it had been abandoned. Half-finished batch of mash sat fermenting in the wooden barrels. The fire pit under the copper kettle was cold. Why would someone build all this and just walk away? I was photographing the still when I heard footsteps. Not trying to be. Quiet, heavy boots on gravel, coming down the path I'd just climbed. Finally, someone I could arrest. "Ranger service," I called out. "Stop where you are and identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening to my own heartbeat. The forest had gone completely silent again. Even the wind had died down. "I know you're there," I said. "Come out where I can see you." That's when I saw the light. A soft glow moving between the trees, like someone carrying a lantern. But it wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight. This light flickered and danced, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The light came closer, and I could make out a figure behind it, a man in dark clothes, walking slowly down the path. He carried something in his hands, a mason jar that glowed with the same strange light I'd seen earlier. "Stop right there." I drew my service weapon. "Put down what you're carrying and get on the ground." The figure kept walking. As he got closer, I could see his face in the jar's glow. An older man with deep lines around his eyes, wearing clothes that looked like they came from an old movie. Suspenders, work shirt, heavy boots. His expression was sad but determined. I said, "Stop." I aimed my weapon at center mass, just like they taught me in training. The man looked up at me and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. "You got the look of an ironwood," he said. His voice sounded far away, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "But you're wearing the wrong uniform, boy." That's when I noticed the hole in his chest. A dark stain on his work shirt, right over his heart. Fresh blood that gleamed wet in the jar's light. I blinked hard, shook my head. When I looked again, the man was gone. But the jar sat on the ground where he'd been standing, still glowing. My hands were shaking as I holstered my weapon. Stress hallucination, that's all. Too much time alone in the mountains, not enough sleep. The mind plays tricks when you're tired and scared. I picked up the jar. The glass felt real enough, cool and smooth under my fingers. The liquid inside moved when I tilted it. Definitely some kind of alcohol, but it gave off light like nothing I'd ever seen. My radio crackled to life. "Sam, you copy?" "Sam, come in." I grabbed the handset. "This is Ironwood. Go ahead." Static filled the channel for several seconds. Then a voice I didn't recognize said, "You shouldn't have come here, boy. This place ain't for lawmen." I checked the frequency. Still set to the Ranger channel. But nobody at headquarters sounded like that old mountain accent, like my grandfather used to talk. "Who is this?" "What?" I demanded. "Identify yourself." "Sam? Sam, are you there? This is base. Please respond." Now it was dispatch, clear as day. But I just heard another voice on the same frequency. Equipment malfunction. Had to be. Radio signals bouncing off the mountains in strange ways. I was trying to reach base when I heard the fiddle music. Slow and mournful, coming from somewhere up the ridge. An old song I'd heard my grandfather hum when I was little. The melody drifted through the trees like smoke, beautiful and sad. But there was nobody up there. I'd checked the whole area. I followed the music deeper into the hollow, past the still, and into a section of forest I'd never seen before. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy so dense that moonlight barely touched the ground. But I could see anyway, because more lights were moving between the trees. Dozens of them, men carrying glowing jars, walking in single file along a path that shouldn't exist. They moved like they had all the time in the world, unhurried and purposeful. Some limped, some had dark stains on their clothes. I hid behind a large oak and watched them pass. They looked real enough I could hear their footsteps, smelled tobacco smoke and sweat. But something was wrong with the scene. The men's clothes were all from the same era, 1,920 seconds work gear. And none of them cast shadows. The last man in line stopped directly in front of my hiding place. He turned and looked right at me, though I was sure I couldn't be seen. "Evening, Samuel," he said. "Been waiting a long time to see you again." I knew that voice, knew that face, even though I'd only seen it in old photographs. "Grandfather," the word came out as a whisper. Jeremiah Ironwood nodded slowly. He looked exactly like the pictures, except for the hole in his chest where the federal bullet had killed him. Blood still dripped from the wound, dark and fresh. "You grew up to be a fine-looking man," he said. "Shame about the badge." I tried to speak, but no words would come. My grandfather had been dead for 60 years. This couldn't be happening. "We got business to discuss, you and me," he continued. "About what happened here, about what you're going to do about it." The other figures had stopped and turned to watch us. A dozen men, all with similar wounds, all carrying those glowing jars, all looking at me with expressions I couldn't read. "You're not real," I managed to say. "You're all dead." My grandfather's smile was infinitely sad. "Dead don't mean gone, boy. Not when there's debts to be paid." He gestured to the other men. "Meet your family, Samuel. Meet the men who died defending their way of life against government thieves." "You were criminals," I said, finding my voice. "You broke the law." "Whose law?" Grandfather asked. "The law that said a man couldn't make an honest living? The law that sent armed thugs to murder mountain folks?" He stepped closer, and I could smell the corn mash on his breath. "The law you've been enforcing all your life?" I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The dead men formed a circle around me, their glowing jars casting everything in eerie light. The fiddle music grew louder, joined by gru and other instruments. A ghostly band playing songs from before I was born. "What do you want?" I asked. "Justice," my grandfather said. "For what was done to us. For what's still being done." He pointed toward the ridge. "Every month government men come through here, drug agents, like you used to be, looking to arrest folks for the same crimes we died for." "It's not the same thing," I protested. "Marijuana, moonshine, they're different." "Are they?" Grandfather tilted his head. "Both grow from the ground. Both help folks get by. Both get a man killed for trying to make $1. The other spirits moved closer. I could see their wounds now: bullet holes, knife cuts, rope burns around necks. Men who died violent deaths, all of them. "You want to know what really happened that night in 1927? Grandfather asked. Before I could answer, the world changed around me. I was still standing in the same forest, but everything looked different. Brighter. The trees were younger, the path wider and well used. Electric lights had replaced the ghostly glowwork lamps strung between the branches, powered by a generator I could hear rumbling nearby. It was 1927, and I was watching my grandfather die. The moonshine operation was in full swing. Men worked around 3 separate stills, filling jars and loading them into wooden crates. Others stood guard with rifles, watching the paths for revenuers. The whole hollow buzzed with activity, a factory producing liquid gold for thirsty cities. "Biggest operation in the county," said a voice behind me. I turned and saw my grandfather as he'd been in life, young and strong, without the fatal wound. Kept half of Tennessee supplied with good corn liquor. I tried to touch him, but my hand passed right through his shoulder. I was a ghost here, watching history unfold. "We weren't hurting nobody," Grandfather continued, "just making a product people wanted. Government had no business telling a man what he could and couldn't brew on his own land." Shouts echoed from the ridge above. "Federal agents, everyone on the ground." The moonshiners scattered like deer, some running for the trees, others grabbing weapons. My grandfather stood his ground in the center of the operation, a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. "This is my mountain," he yelled toward the approaching agents. "You got no right." The federal men came down the path in a line, military-style formation. They wore suits and ties but carried their weapons like soldiers. Their leader was a thin man with a badge pinned to his vest. "Jeremiah Ironwood," the agent called out. "You're under arrest for violation of the Volstead Act." "Come and take me," Grandfather replied. What happened next was slaughter, not law enforcement. The agents opened fire without warning. Not warning shots, aimed fire, meant to kill. My grandfather got off one blast from his shotgun before the bullets found him. He fell backward, blood spreading across his chest. But he wasn't the only one who died. The agents shot anyone who moved, men trying to surrender, men trying to run. Even an old man who was just trying to hide behind a tree. The federal bullets cut them down like wheat. In 5 minutes, it was over. 12 men lay dead in the hollow, their blood soaking into mountain soil. The agents poured out the moonshine, smashed the equipment, and set fire to everything that would burn. Self-defense, the lead agent told his men as they prepared to leave. They fired first. Write it up that way. But I'd seen what really happened. Murder. Cold-blooded murder of men whose only crime was making liquor. The vision faded, and I was back in 1987. My grandfather stood before me again, hole in his chest, weeping fresh blood. "Now you know," he said. "Now you understand what your badge really represents." I felt sick. My whole career, everything I'd believed about law and order, it was built on lies. "That was 60 years ago," I said weakly. "Things are different now." "Are they?" Another voice spoke from the darkness. A young man stepped into the circle of light. He wore modern clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, but his face was gray as old newspaper. A rope burn circled his neck like a red collar. "Billy Henderson," he introduced himself. "Died 3 months ago. Your old ATF buddies found my marijuana garden up on Fisher's Peak." My blood went cold. I remembered that case. Henderson had been a fugitive, armed and dangerous, according to the reports. Shot while resisting arrest. "That's not what happened," Billy continued, reading my thoughts. "I tried to run, made it maybe 50 yards before they put a bullet in my back. Fell off the cliff trying to get away." He pulled up his shirt, showing the exit wound. "Planted a gun on me afterward. Made it look like a firefight." "You're lying," I said, but my voice shook. I'd known some of those agents. Good men, family men. They wouldn't. "Ask yourself," my grandfather interrupted. "How many of your arrests fought back? How many tried to kill officers?" I thought about it. In 8 years with the ATF, I'd made over 50 drug arrests. Most of the suspects had surrendered peacefully. The ones who got shot were usually running away, not shooting back. "That's law enforcement," I said. "Sometimes force is necessary." "Like it was necessary here?" Grandfather gestured to the other spirits. Each one stepped forward and told his story. Government bullets, every one of them. Men who died for the crime of trying to make a living in the mountains. "You're all criminals," I insisted, but the words sounded hollow. "The law is the law." "Whose law?" Grandfather asked again. "Law made by politicians who never set foot in these mountains? Law designed to protect big business from mountain competition?" The spirits pressed closer, their wounds gleaming in the jar light. I could smell death on them, old blood and grave dirt. But underneath that was something else, the clean smell of mountain water, pine needles, honest sweat. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Justice," they said in unison. "For the dead, for the living, for the mountains themselves." "I can't bring you back," I said. "I can't change what happened." "No," Grandfather agreed, "but you can stop it from happening again." He pointed toward the ridge. "More agents coming. Tomorrow night." They got reports of the marijuana operation. "Gonna be another raid. Another armed fugitive that needs killing." "How do you know?" "Dead men hear everything," Billy Henderson said. "Radio signals, telephone calls, whispered conversations. We know what's coming. So warn whoever's running the operation," I said. "Tell them to get out." "Already tried," Grandfather replied. "Living folks can't see us, can't hear us. Only family can. Only you." The weight of it hit me like a hammer. They wanted me to interfere with a federal operation, to help criminals escape justice. "I won't do it," I said. "I'm still a law officer." The spirits' expressions turned angry. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and the lights in their jars flared brighter. "Then, you're no grandson of mine," my grandfather snarled. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like something alive and furious. The spirits began to fade, but their voices grew louder. "Government man, badge-wearing killer, traitor to your own blood." I tried to run, but the forest had changed around me. Paths led in circles, trees moved when I wasn't looking, and every direction took me back to the still. The dead men's voices followed me, accusing and angry. By dawn, I was exhausted and completely lost. My radio was nothing but static, my GPS showed impossible coordinates, and my flashlight had died hours ago. The only light came from those cursed mason jars, scattered throughout the forest like fallen stars. I found a stream and drank, trying to think clearly. Everything I'd seen could be explained. Stress hallucinations, equipment malfunction, too little sleep, and too much imagination. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But the jars were real. I could hold them, smell the liquor inside, and the bodies in the graveyard had real dates, real names. My grandfather's grave was exactly where the spirit had stood. Something was happening here. Something beyond normal explanation. I had to get out, had to report what I'd found. Let someone else deal with the marijuana operation and whatever was haunting these mountains. I was just a park ranger, not a ghost hunter. But as I tried to find my way back to the trail, I heard helicopters in the distance. The federal agents were coming, just like the spirits had predicted. And somewhere in the forest ahead, someone was about to die. The helicopters landed on the ridge just after sunset. I watched from the tree line as federal agents unloaded equipment and weapons. Automatic rifles, body armor, night vision goggles, enough firepower to fight a small war. Leading the operation was Agent Rick Dalton, my old partner from the ATF. We'd worked together for 3 years, made dozens of arrests. Good man as far as I knew. Father of 2, coached Little League baseball. I could warn him. Tell him the operation was abandoned, that there was no one to arrest. Maybe prevent whatever was going to happen. But that would mean admitting I believed in ghosts. The marijuana growers had come back during the day. 3 young men, college age, tending their plants and checking the irrigation system. They had no idea what was coming. No idea they were about to be slaughtered. I crouched in the darkness, torn between duty and conscience. These were criminals, breaking federal law. They deserved to be arrested, but they didn't deserve to die. The spirits materialized around me as the agents began their approach. My grandfather, Billy Henderson, and the others, all watching, all waiting to see what I would do. Still time to warn them, grandfather whispered. They're criminals, I said. So was I. So were you, every time you broke the speed limit or had a drink before you turned 21. That's different. No, Billy Henderson said. It's not. Law is law, right? Isn't that what you said? The agents moved down the hillside in tactical formation. They'd surround the growers, then demand surrender. But I knew how these operations really worked. Armed and dangerous suspects rarely survived to trial. You could stop this, grandfather said. Fire a warning shot. Tell them you're conducting a ranger patrol. Give the boys time to run. I won't interfere with a federal operation. Then you'll watch them die, just like we did. The agents reached the marijuana garden. I could see the growers clearly now, kids. Really, maybe 20 years old. They'd come up here to water their plants and check for mold. Probably their first serious crime. Federal agents. Dalton's voice echoed through the hollow. Everyone on the ground, now. The growers panicked. Instead of surrendering, they ran. That's when the shooting started. Muzzle flashes lit up the forest like deadly fireflies. The agents fired automatically, filling the air with bullets. One grower went down immediately, blood blooming across his back. The other 2 made it into the trees before the gunfire found them. In 30 seconds, it was over. 3 young men lay dead in their own marijuana garden. Jesus, I whispered. There's your justice, grandfather said bitterly. There's your law and order. Agent Dalton was already on his radio. Base, this is Strike Team Alpha. 3 suspects down. They opened fire first. We responded in self-defense. But I'd seen the truth. The growers never fired a shot. Never even had weapons. You could report it, Billy Henderson suggested. Tell your superiors what really happened. Who would believe me? Does that matter? The spirits pressed closer, their wounds fresh and bright in the moonlight. 60 years of government murders, and nothing had changed. Nothing would change unless someone broke the cycle. What do you want me to do? I asked. Justice, they said in unison. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The mason jars began to glow brighter, casting weird shadows that moved independently of their owners. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath. Show them, grandfather commanded. Show them what happens to government killers in our mountains. I won't murder federal agents, I said. Won't have to. Billy Henderson smiled, showing teeth stained with grave dirt. We'll do that part. The spirits began to move toward the ridge where the agents were celebrating their successful operation. They flowed between the trees like fog, invisible to living eyes, but carrying decades of accumulated rage. I followed, knowing I should stop them, but not knowing how. The agents had gathered around their helicopters, comparing stories and lighting cigarettes. They joked about the dead growers, calling them tree huggers and hippie scum. Standard law enforcement bravado after a shooting. That's when the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the helicopter windshields in seconds. The agent's breath came out in white clouds, and someone cursed the sudden cold front. Equipment malfunction, one agent reported. Radios are picking up some kind of interference. The interference was fiddle music. Old mountain tunes, played by dead fingers on ghostly strings. What the hell is that? Dalton demanded. The music grew louder, joined by other instruments. A full band of spirits, playing songs from before any of them were born. The agents drew their weapons, but there was nothing to shoot at. That's when they saw the lights. Mason jars floating through the forest, glowing like captured stars. Dozens of them, moving in formation toward the landing zone. Behind each jar walked a figure in old-fashioned clothes, transparent as window glass. Contact! An agent screamed. Multiple contacts approaching from the tree line. They opened fire on empty air. Muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness, but the bullets passed harmlessly through their targets. The spirits kept coming, walking through gunfire like it was rain. The agents broke and ran. Trained federal officers, fleeing from ghosts like children from a nightmare. They scrambled into their helicopters, leaving equipment scattered on the ground. But the helicopters wouldn't start. Engine failure on both birds, the pilot reported. Electronics are completely fried. The spirits surrounded the aircraft, their jar lights reflecting off the metal like liquid fire. My grandfather approached the lead helicopter, walking through the spinning rotor blades. He pressed his face against the windscreen and smiled at Agent Dalton. Dalton screamed. Whatever he saw in my grandfather's expression, the wound, the accusation, the 60 years of accumulated rage, it broke something inside him. He clawed at the door, desperate to escape, but the handle wouldn't turn. "Let me out," he begged. "Please, let me out." The other agents were having similar experiences, each one confronted by their own personal ghost, forced to see the faces of everyone they'd killed in the line of duty. The spirits didn't hurt them physically, they didn't need to. Guilt was a sharper weapon than any knife. I watched from the tree line as federal agents sobbed like children, begging forgiveness from the dead. Some would never recover. Some would eat their service weapons rather than face another night of nightmares. "Justice," my grandfather said, appearing beside, "to me." But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like revenge. "This isn't right," I said. "Neither was murdering mountain folks for 60 years. Two wrongs don't make a right." Grandfather laughed, but there was no humor in it. Easy words from someone who never felt a government bullet. The helicopter engines finally caught, and the aircraft lifted off in a panic. They left half their equipment behind, along with the bodies of the 3 growers. Official reports would blame equipment failure and bad weather for the mission's failure. The dead growers would be buried quietly, their families told they died resisting arrest. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked the spirits. "Federal agents too scared to do their jobs?" "It's a start," Billy Henderson replied, "but I realized something had changed in me during that long night. I'd seen too much, learned too much about the real nature of law enforcement. I couldn't go back to being a simple park ranger who believed in justice and order." "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you," Grandfather said. "You can keep wearing that badge, keep serving the same system that murdered us, or you can do something different." "Like what?" "Protect the mountains, protect the people, be the kind of lawman we needed 60 years ago." The spirits began to fade as dawn approached, their jar lights dimming like dying stars. But before they disappeared completely, my grandfather handed me something. A badge, old and tarnished, but clearly marked Deputy Sheriff, Copper Ridge County. "Wear this instead," he said. "Serve the mountains, not the government." "Copper Ridge County doesn't exist anymore," I protested. "It does now," he smiled. "If you say it does." The official report blamed equipment failure for the mission's abort. Atmospheric pressure, radio interference, mechanical problems with both helicopters. The 3 dead growers were listed as armed fugitives, who fired first. I filed my own report about the abandoned marijuana operation, claiming the site was empty when I arrived. Technically true, I never mentioned the growers' return. Agent Dalton took early retirement 2 weeks later. Nervous breakdown, according to his file. Several other agents from the operation requested transfers to desk jobs. Word spread quietly through federal circles. Stay away from Copper Ridge. I kept working as a park ranger, but things were different now. The badge my grandfather gave me hangs on a chain around my neck, hidden under my uniform shirt. It reminds me who I really serve. The mountains protect themselves now, with my help. Drug operations still happen, but they're different. Small family grows, medical marijuana for sick relatives, moonshine for traditional purposes. I don't report everything I find. But the commercial operations, the violent cartels, the men who come to exploit the mountains, they find things don't go well for them in Copper Ridge. Equipment fails, people get lost, accidents happen. Nothing that can be traced back to me. The spirits don't appear often anymore, but I know they're there. Sometimes I find mason jars full of fresh moonshine sitting on my porch. Sometimes I hear fiddle music on the wind when I'm patrolling alone. And sometimes, when federal agents come looking for trouble, they find more than they bargained for. The mountains remember everything. The mountains keep score. I learned that some laws are worth breaking, and some justice comes from outside the courtroom. My grandfather was a criminal by government standards, but he was a good man by mountain standards. Those are the standards that matter here. 6 months after the helicopter incident, I got a call from my supervisor. Hikers had found 3 bodies in a remote section of Copper Ridge, the growers who'd been shot by federal agents. The bodies were arranged respectfully, buried in proper graves marked with wooden crosses. Any idea who might have done this? My supervisor asked. I looked at the photographs. The graves were in the same hidden cemetery where my grandfather was buried, where all the mountain dead rested together. No idea, I told him. Must have been family. Which was true, in a way. We're all family in the mountains. Living and dead, law-abiding and criminal, federal agents and moonshiners. The mountains don't distinguish between good and evil the way governments do. They only distinguish between those who belong and those who don't. I belong here now, badge or no badge. The spirits made sure of that. And late at night, when the moon is full and the mist rises from the hollows, I sometimes see lights moving through the forest. Mason jars glowing like fallen stars, carried by men who died for the simple right to make a living in their own mountains. They're still out there, still protecting what's theirs, still making sure the mountains get their due. Some nights, I carry a jar of my own and walk with them. My name is Rebecca Stormwind, but everyone calls me Becca. I've been a park ranger for 16 years now, working the Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. My specialty is mine safety and cleaning up old mining sites. It's not glamorous work, but it matters to me more than most people understand. You see, my father died in a mine collapse when I was 12. That's what got me into this line of work. I studied mining engineering in college, then joined the Park Service to make sure abandoned mines don't hurt anyone else. I've assessed over 30 mine sites in my career, and I know what to look for. Blackheart Mountain was supposed to be routine, just another old coal mine that needed environmental cleanup before the area could be open to hikers. The paperwork said it was a small operation that closed in 1962 after some kind of accident. Nothing unusual there. Lots of mines shut down in the 60s when safety regulations got stricter. It was November 1991, and winter was coming early to the mountains. I drove my Park Service truck up the winding dirt road that led to what used to be a company town. Now it was just empty foundations and rotting wood scattered across a valley that looked like someone had taken giant bites out of the hillsides. Strip mining does that to a place. Leaves scars that never heal. I parked near the main mine entrance and started unloading my equipment. Gas detector, hard hat with a good lamp, structural assessment tools, and my camera for documentation. The air was cold and still, with that heavy feeling you get before a storm. The mine entrance was bigger than I expected, wide enough to drive a truck through. Someone had put up a rusty metal gate years ago, but it hung open on broken hinges. Warning signs covered in bullet holes said, "Danger, keep out," and "Unsafe mine, entry prohibited." I clipped my gas detector to my belt and turned it on. Immediately, it started beeping. Methane levels were elevated, which wasn't unusual for an old coal mine. What was strange was how the readings kept changing. 1 second it would show normal levels, the next it would spike like there was a gas leak somewhere. I checked the detector twice. It was working fine. I spent the morning walking around the outside of the mine, taking pictures and making notes. The subsidence patterns were weird. Most abandoned mines settle gradually, creating shallow depressions. But here, the ground had collapsed in sharp, straight lines, like someone had drawn a map of the underground tunnels with a giant pencil. That wasn't how subsidence worked. By lunch, I was starting to feel uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Even the wind had died down. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. I ate my sandwich sitting on the tailgate of my truck, looking at the mine entrance. In the afternoon shadows, it looked like a mouth. A big, dark mouth that was waiting to swallow something. I shook my head and finished my lunch. 16 years of mine work, and I was starting to think like some superstitious local. There were no such things as cursed mines or mountain spirits, just old industrial sites that needed proper cleanup. But as I packed up to head into town for the night, I could have sworn I saw something move in the darkness beyond that broken gate. Just for a second. Like a shadow walking where no shadow should be. I told myself it was a deer. The next morning, I drove back up to start the real work. I'd spent the evening at the county library, reading old newspaper reports about the mine closure. The official story was simple. Structural failure led to a collapse that killed some miners. The exact number wasn't clear. Different articles said different things. What bothered me was how little information there was. Usually, mine disasters generate lots of paperwork, safety investigations, insurance claims, lawsuits from families. But for Blackheart Mountain, there was almost nothing after 1962. I set up my equipment at the mine entrance and put on my hard hat. The headlamp beam cut through the darkness, showing wooden support beams and rusty rail tracks disappearing into the mountain. The air smelled like coal dust and something else, something sweet and rotten. My gas detector was going crazy again, beeping on and off like it couldn't make up its mind. I tapped it a few times, but the readings kept jumping around. 20 feet into the mine, I found the first strange thing. Footprints. Fresh ones, in the coal dust on the floor. I knelt down and examined them with my flashlight. Boot prints, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive tread pattern. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that they were filled with coal dust, like someone had been walking around and leaving a trail of black powder. I followed the prints deeper into the mine. They led to a side tunnel, then just stopped. In the middle of the passage, with solid rock walls on both sides. No place for whoever made them to go. I took pictures and measurements, trying to think of a logical explanation. Maybe someone had been here recently and I just couldn't see where they'd turned around. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me. But when I looked back at my own footprints, they were clean. No coal dust trails, just normal boot marks in the dirt. I spent the next hour exploring the main tunnel system. The mine was bigger than I'd expected, with multiple levels connected by wooden ladders and narrow passages. Most of the support timbers were in good shape, which was unusual for a mine that had been abandoned for 30 years. It was in the lower level that I heard the first sound. Tap, 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 metal on stone, echoing from somewhere deeper in the mine. Steady and rhythmic, like someone working with a pickaxe. I stopped walking and I listened. The sound came again, from a tunnel to my left. Then silence. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed strangely, like the tunnel walls were absorbing the sound. "This is Park Service. Mine's closed to the public." No answer, just that heavy silence that felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I followed the sound down the left tunnel, my headlamp beam dancing ahead of me. The passage narrowed as it went deeper, and I had to duck under low-hanging support beams. The air was getting colder, too. Cold enough that I could see my breath. That shouldn't happen in a mine. Underground temperatures stay constant year-round. The tunnel ended at a wall of fallen rock, a cave-in, old enough that dust had settled over everything. but there were tool marks on the stones. Fresh ones, like someone had been trying to dig through from the other side. I examined the rocks more closely. Some of them had scratches that looked almost like letters or numbers. 47, carved deep into the stone. The tapping sound came again, but this time it was behind me. I spun around, and my headlamp beam swept across the tunnel walls. Nothing there, but I could swear I'd seen something move just at the edge of the light. Something dark and low to the ground. "If someone's in here, you need to come out now," I said, louder this time. "This mine isn't safe." The beam of my headlamp flickered and went out. I stood in complete darkness, fumbling for my backup flashlight. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat, and underneath that, very faintly, the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. My flashlight clicked on, and the tunnel was empty. But there was something new on the ground. More footprints, dozens of them, all leading toward the cave-in, and every single one was filled with coal dust that seemed to glitter in my flashlight beam. I backed out of the tunnel as fast as I could without running. By the time I reached the mine entrance, my hands were shaking and my heart was racing. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, trying to calm down and think rationally. Equipment malfunction, that had to be it. Old mines played tricks on your senses. Bad air could cause hallucinations. The footprints were probably mine from earlier, and I just hadn't noticed the coal dust before. But when I looked at my boots, they were clean. I should have left then. Filed a report about unstable conditions and recommended the mine be sealed permanently. But something was nagging at me about those newspaper articles. The numbers didn't add up. That evening, I drove to the nearest town and found Earl Blackwood at the VFW hall. He was 78 years old and one of the few people still alive who'd worked at Blackheart Mountain. When I introduced myself and mentioned the mine, his face went pale. "You shouldn't be poking around up there," he said, gripping his beer bottle so tight his knuckles went white. "Some places are better left alone." "I'm just doing an environmental assessment, Mr. Blackwood, making sure the site is safe." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Safe? That place hasn't been safe since 1962. Maybe never was." I pulled out my notebook. The newspaper said there was an accident, a cave-in. "Accident," Earl spat into his beer. "That's what they called it. Wasn't no accident, miss. That was murder." He told me the real story then, in a voice that got quieter with every word. How the mine company had been cutting corners on safety for months before the collapse. How they'd removed support timbers to get at coal seams that should have been left alone. How the miners had complained, and the company had threatened to fire anyone who kept talking. 47 good men died that day, Earl said. 47. They're still down there, you know. Companies sealed up the tunnels where they fell. Said it was too dangerous to recover the bodies. What happened to the company? Nothing. They had politicians in their pocket, judges too. Paid off the families to keep quiet, threatened the ones who wouldn't take money. Official cause was listed as geological instability. Natural disaster. Earl leaned across the table. But we knew better, and so did the mountain. What do you mean? People see things up there. Dark shapes moving around the mine entrance. Lights that shouldn't exist. Tools moving on their own. The mountain remembers what happened, miss, and it won't let anyone forget. I thanked Earl and drove back to my motel, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 47 miners, buried alive because some executives wanted to save money on timber. It was the same kind of corporate greed that had killed my father. The next morning, I called my supervisor in Richmond and requested access to the state mining records. What I found made my stomach turn. Blackheart Mountain Mining Company, the same corporation that had owned the mine where my father died 15 years later. Same pattern of safety violations, same political connections, same cover-up after the accident. I sat in my truck outside the mine entrance, staring at the documents. My father hadn't died in a random industrial accident. He'd been murdered by the same corporate machine that had killed those 47 miners in 1962. That's when I decided to go back into the mine. Not for the Park Service, but for my father. And for 47 men whose deaths had never been properly investigated. This time, I brought better equipment. Professional mining gear, emergency beacon, extra batteries for everything. I was going to document every inch of that mine and find evidence of the safety violations that had caused the collapse. The tunnel felt different as soon as I stepped inside. Colder. The air pressure seemed wrong, like being in an airplane that was changing altitude too fast. My gas detector was beeping constantly now, but the readings still made no sense. I followed the main tunnel to the first junction and started mapping the layout. Most mines follow the coal seams, creating a maze of interconnected passages, but Blackheart Mountain's tunnels were different. They formed a pattern, like spokes on a wheel, all leading to a central hub. That hub was where the collapse had happened. I could see it from 50 yards away, a massive wall of fallen rock and twisted support beams. But as I got closer, I realized something impossible. The cave-in was fresh. The broken timber was still light-colored, not darkened with age. Dust hung in the air like the collapse had happened yesterday. But Earl Blackwood had said the tunnel was sealed in 1962, nearly 30 years ago. I examined the debris more closely. Some of the rocks had dates scratched into them. The 12th of December, 1962, the day of the collapse, and underneath the dates, names: William Carson, Miguel Santos, Thomas Chen, James Running Bear. 47 names in total. I was photographing the wall when I heard voices, muffled and distant but definitely human, coming from behind the rockfall. Men's voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, and underneath the voices, the sound of digging. Metal on stone, getting faster and more desperate. I pressed my ear against the rocks. The voices were clearer now, and what I heard made my blood freeze. Help us, someone help us, we're trapped. The roof came down. Can anyone hear us? I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. Those voices were coming from a sealed mine tunnel where 47 men had died 30 years ago. It was impossible. But then one of the voices called out a name that stopped me cold. Rebecca. Rebecca Stormwind. My headlamp beam started flickering. Not the bulb failing, but like something was interfering with the electrical current. In the strobing light, I saw them, shadows, human-shaped shadows standing between me and the mine entrance. Dark figures wearing mining helmets with lights that glowed like dying stars. They weren't solid. I could see the tunnel wall through them, but they were definitely there. We've been waiting for you, one of them said. Its voice sounded like coal dust falling on metal. Waiting for someone who would understand. I ran. I ran through those tunnels faster than I'd ever run in my life, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like wind blowing through dry leaves. And voices, dozens of voices, all calling my name. I burst out of the mine entrance and didn't stop running until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. 47 shadows stood at the mine entrance, watching me go. I didn't sleep for 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadow figures. Heard their voices calling my name. I knew I should leave, file a report, and let someone else deal with Blackheart Mountain, but I couldn't. Not when I finally understood what was happening. The mining company was still in business, still cutting corners, still bribing officials, still getting miners killed. And in 2 days, they were coming to Blackheart Mountain for a site inspection. They wanted to reopen the mine. The ghosts weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to warn me. I spent those 3 days researching everything I could find about Blackheart Mountain Mining Company. What I discovered was a pattern of corruption that went back decades. Politicians paid off, safety inspectors bought, families threatened into silence. The same system that had killed my father was still operating, but this time I had evidence. And I had witnesses who couldn't be silenced or bought off. On the morning of the company inspection, I went back to the mine. Not as a park ranger doing an environmental assessment, but as the daughter of a murdered miner seeking justice. The shadows were waiting for me at the entrance. They looked more solid now, more real. I could see details I'd missed before. The names on their hard hats, the expressions of fear and anger on their faces, the coal dust that covered them like a burial shroud. "You came back," one of them said. I recognized the voice from that first day in the tunnel. "I know what you want," I said. "Justice. The truth about what really happened." "The company men are coming," another shadow said. "They want to open the mine again. Send more men to die." "We can't let that happen," said a third. "Too many have died already." They led me into the mine, deeper than I'd ever gone before. Past the main collapse site, through narrow passages that shouldn't have existed according to my maps. The temperature dropped with every step until my breath was coming out in white clouds. At the heart of the mine, they showed me their secret. A chamber carved from solid rock, filled with equipment and documents that had been hidden for 30 years. Safety reports that were never filed. Internal memos discussing known structural problems. Photographs of the damaged support beams that the company had ordered workers to ignore. And a list of names. Not just the 47 who had died in 1962, but dozens of others. Miners who had been killed in accidents at company sites across Virginia and West Virginia, including my father. They've been doing this for 50 years, the lead shadow told me. Buying silence, hiding evidence, letting men die for profit. But the dead remember everything. What do you want me to do? Take the evidence, show the world, stop them before they kill again. I started loading documents into my bag, but that's when I heard voices from the mine entrance. Real voices this time. The company inspection team had arrived early. "Miss Stormwind?" A man's voice echoed down the tunnels. "Park Service? We're here for the site visit." I looked at the shadows. They were starting to fade, becoming transparent. "They can't see us when the living are near," the lead shadow explained. "But we can still act. Help us, Rebecca. Help us finish this." The voices were getting closer. I could see flashlight beams moving in the main tunnel. "This way," I whispered, and started toward a side passage that would let me circle around to the entrance. But the shadows had other plans. As the company men entered the mine, the temperature plummeted. Their flashlights began flickering and failing. The support beams started creaking like they were under tremendous pressure. "What the hell?" I heard one of them shout. Then the shadows appeared. Not just the 47 from Blackheart Mountain, but dozens of others. All the miners who had died because of company greed. They materialized out of the darkness like a wave of coal dust and anger. The company men screamed and ran for the entrance, but the shadows were faster. They surrounded the inspection team, pressing close, whispering the names of the dead and the dates of their murders. I used the confusion to slip out of the mine with the evidence. But as I reached my truck, I heard a rumbling sound from deep underground. The mine was collapsing, not from structural failure this time, but from the weight of accumulated anger. The mountain itself was rejecting the men who had turned it into a grave. The company men came running out of the entrance just as the first support beams gave way. They piled into their cars and drove away as fast as they could, leaving behind briefcases and equipment in their panic. The rumbling continued for another 10 minutes, then gradually faded to silence. When the dust settled, the mine entrance was completely sealed. Not by fallen rocks this time, but by the mountain itself. The opening had, simply, closed, like the earth was healing over an old wound. I stood there for a long time, holding the evidence that would finally bring justice to 47 dead miners and my father. In the absolute silence that followed the collapse, I could have sworn I heard voices one last time. "Thank you," they whispered. "Thank you for remembering." The evidence I recovered from Blackheart Mountain brought down one of the largest mining corporations in the Southeast. The FBI investigation that followed uncovered 50 years of corruption, bribery, and criminal negligence. Executives went to prison. Families finally got justice and compensation. The mine stays sealed. The Park Service classified the area as geologically unstable and off-limits to the public. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, people driving past Blackheart Mountain report seeing lights moving in the forest. Miners' lamps, they say, still keeping watch. I left the Park Service 6 months later and started working with families of industrial accident victims, helping them fight the same corporate systems that had killed their loved ones. It's hard work, but necessary. Because the dead remember everything, and someone needs to speak for them. Sometimes I dream about that chamber deep in the mine, filled with evidence of corporate crimes. In my dreams, it's still there, waiting for the next person who has the courage to seek the truth. The shadows guard it, patient and eternal. They taught me something important during those few days at Blackheart Mountain. The dead don't stay buried when they've been murdered. They wait in the darkness, preserving the evidence, remembering the names, until someone comes along who's willing to listen. Corporate greed kills. It always has, and it always will, as long as profit matters more than human life. But the victims don't just disappear. They become part of the landscape, part of the mountains and forests, and abandoned places where they died. And they're still watching. Last week, I got a call from a ranger in West Virginia, another abandoned mine with strange activity. Equipment failures, unexplained sounds, shadows moving where shadows shouldn't be. I told him I'd be there Monday morning. After all, someone has to speak for the dead. And I've learned that sometimes, if you listen carefully in the silence of abandoned places, the dead will speak for themselves. My name is Jonathan Grimshaw, but everyone calls me John. I've been a park ranger for 9 years now, working in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. Most folks think rangers just watch for fires and help lost hikers, but my job is different. I'm what they call a cultural resources specialist. I find old places where people used to live and make sure they're protected. I have a PhD in colonial American history, which sounds fancy but really just means I know a lot about how people lived in the 1600s and 1700s. It's October 1994, and I'm 32 years old. I love my work because every day I might find something that changes how we understand the past. Today I'm hiking into a place called Ravens Hollow. It's way out in the wilderness, about 10 miles from the nearest trail. The trees here are huge and old, some of them probably 300 years old or more. The air smells like pine and dead leaves. It's been getting cold at night, which is strange for October in North Carolina. I'm here because a hiker found some old metal pieces last month and reported them. When people find old stuff in the forest, I have to check if it's important. I've got my metal detector, cameras, GPS unit, and all my archaeological tools packed in my backpack. The thing is, I have a personal connection to this area that makes me uncomfortable. My family name, Grimshaw, goes way back. We came from Massachusetts originally. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was involved in the Salem witch trials back in 1692. I don't like to think about it much. Those trials were a dark time when innocent people were killed because of fear and superstition. As I walk deeper into the hollow, I notice something strange. The place is called Ravens Hollow, but I haven't seen a single raven all day. That's weird. Ravens love these mountains, and there should be lots of them here. I set up my metal detector and start sweeping the ground. Within an hour, I find several metal objects buried in the dirt. I carefully dig them up and clean them off. What I find makes my stomach feel tight. There are old kitchen tools, a knife, some nails, parts of a cooking pot. But mixed in with these normal household items are things that don't belong. Pieces of rope, iron chains, and what looks like part of a wooden stake. I sit on a fallen log and stare at the artifacts spread out on my tarp. The household items suggest people lived here long ago. But the rope and chains, those were used for something else, something darker. I take photos of everything and mark the GPS coordinates. According to my equipment, I'm in a spot that's not on any official maps as a historical site. But these artifacts are definitely old, probably from the 1600s or 1700s. The sun is getting lower, and shadows are growing longer between the trees. I pack up my gear and start looking around more carefully. That's when I see them, old stone foundations hidden under years of fallen leaves and dirt. I brush away the debris and find the outline of what was once a small building. Then another, and another. This wasn't just a single cabin. This was a whole settlement that nobody knew about. My hands shake a little as I take more photos. Finding an unknown historical site is the dream of every archaeologist. But something about this place feels wrong. The air is too quiet, too heavy. As I walk around the foundations, I count at least 6 buildings. They're arranged in a defensive pattern, like the people who lived here were afraid of something or someone. I check my watch. It's getting late, and I need to hike back before dark. But as I'm packing up, my digital camera starts acting strange. The LCD screen flickers, and weird shadows appear in the photos that I don't see with my eyes. I tell myself it's just equipment malfunction. These early digital cameras aren't very reliable yet. But something in my gut tells me that's not the whole truth. The walk back to my truck feels longer than it should. Every few minutes, I turn around because I think I hear footsteps behind me. But there's never anyone there. That night, I sit in my cabin and look through the photos on my computer. In several of them, there are dark shapes that look almost like people wearing old-fashioned clothes. But I know there was nobody else in the hollow with me. I rub my eyes and close the laptop. Tomorrow I'll come back with better equipment and start a proper archaeological survey. Whatever happened in Raven's Hollow 300 years ago, I'm going to find out. But deep down, I'm starting to worry that some secrets are better left buried. I wake up early and drive back to Raven's Hollow with a full kit of archaeological equipment. I've been thinking about those strange photos all night. In the daylight, I tell myself they were just shadows and camera glitches. The hike in seems easier today. I know the path now, and I'm excited to start a real excavation. Finding an unknown settlement is huge. This could change what we know about early colonial migration patterns. I set up a proper grid system and start documenting everything carefully. Each artifact gets photographed, measured, and cataloged before I put it in a specimen bag. I'm working like any professional archaeologist would. But weird things keep happening. First, the temperature. Even though it's a sunny October day, the hollow feels cold. My breath comes out in little puffs, like it's winter. I put on my jacket, but it doesn't help much. The cold seems to come from inside my bones. Then my GPS starts acting up. The coordinates keep changing, even when I'm standing in the same spot. Sometimes it shows I'm 50 feet away from where I actually am. Other times it can't get a signal at all, which shouldn't happen with clear sky above me. But the worst thing is the feeling that someone is watching me. I've spent years alone in the wilderness, and you develop a sense about these things. Animals watching you feel different from people watching you. This feels like people. Like several people, standing just out of sight in the trees. Every time I look up from my work, I expect to see someone, but there's never anyone there. Just trees and shadows and silence. Around noon, I'm excavating near the largest foundation when my metal detector goes crazy. It's beeping so fast it sounds like one long tone. I dig carefully and find something that makes my blood go cold. It's a piece of rope. Old rope, probably made from hemp or flax, like they used in colonial times. But it's tied in a specific way, a hangman's noose. I sit back on my heels and stare at it. Why would someone bury a noose? And why here, mixed in with normal household items? I'm taking photos when I hear something that makes me freeze. Voices. Faint, but definitely voices coming from deeper in the hollow. I grab my camera and GPS and move quietly toward the sound. As I get closer, I can make out words, but they're strange. Old-fashioned, like people trying to talk the way they did hundreds of years ago. The devil's servants fled here, one voice says. They think themselves safe in this godless place. We shall find them, another voice answers. The Lord's work must be completed. I creep closer, using trees for cover. My heart is pounding so hard I'm sure they can hear it. Finally, I reach a spot where I can see into a small clearing. There's no one there. The voices continue, but I can't see who's speaking. It's like the words are coming from the air itself. They practice their dark arts in secret, the first voice says. But we know. We always know. I raise my camera and take several photos of the empty clearing. Then I back away slowly, trying not to make any noise. When I check the photos later, they show the same thing my eyes saw, an empty clearing with old trees and fallen leaves. But the Protion voices were real. I know they were real. I spend the rest of the day working in the excavation area, but I can't concentrate. Every few minutes, I think I see movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes moving between the trees. But when I look directly, there's nothing. As the afternoon goes on, the temperature drops even more. My hands get so cold I can barely hold my tools. I should go back, but I'm close to something important. I can feel it. I'm working on the foundation of what might have been a church when I find the second artifact that changes everything. It's a small wooden cross, carved from dark wood. But it's been burned, and there are dark stains on it that look suspiciously like blood. I hold it up to the light and notice something carved into the back. Letters, burned into the wood. E.g. 1692. E.g. my initials are J.G., Jonathan Grimshaw. My family name. I think about what I know of my family history. My ancestor was named Ezekiel Grimshaw. He lived in Salem during the witch trials. The burned cross falls from my numb fingers. That's when I see him. A tall man in black clothes, standing about 50 feet away at the edge of the clearing. He's wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, like the Puritans used to wear. His face is pale and gaunt, with dark eyes that seem to look right through me. I blink, thinking it's my imagination, but he's still there. He raises one arm and points directly at me. "Grimshaw," he says, and his voice carries across the clearing like a cold wind. "You have come home at last." I grab my gear and run. I don't stop running until I reach my truck. My hands shake so badly it takes 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I drive away, I keep checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that tall figure in black following me. But the road behind me is empty. That night, I sit in my cabin with all the lights on and research my family history. What I find makes me wish I'd never gone to Ravens Hollow in the first place. Ezekiel Grimshaw wasn't just involved in the Salem witch trials. He was one of the leaders, one of the most fanatical witch hunters. And according to old church records, he led a group of men south in late 1692, pursuing suspected witches who had fled Salem. They were never seen again. Now I know why that place is called Ravens Hollow. Ravens are scavengers. They gather where people die. And I'm starting to understand that some of those people never really left. I don't sleep much that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pale face and those dark, judging eyes. But I'm a historian and a scientist. I can't just run away from this. I need to understand what happened in that hollow. The next morning, I drive to the local library and start researching. What I find in the old records makes my stomach turn. In October 1692, a group of accused witches fled Salem and headed south into the wilderness. They were families, mothers, fathers, children, just trying to escape the madness of the trials. Most were probably innocent people caught up in hysteria and politics, but Ezekiel Grimshaw and 4 other men followed them. The church records describe it as a holy mission to purge the devil's servants from the earth. The last entry about Ezekiel's group is from November 1692. It just says, they went into the mountains of North Carolina and were never heard from again. I drive back to Ravens Hollow with a heavy heart and a truck full of equipment. This time I bring camping gear. If I'm going to understand what happened here, I need to stay overnight. I need to experience what this place is like when the sun goes down. The hike in feels different today, heavier, like the very air is pushing against me, trying to keep me away. But I push through and set up my camp near the excavation site. During the day, I continue my archaeological work. I find more artifacts that tell the story piece by piece. Children's toys, women's jewelry, cooking pots and farming tools. These were normal families who just wanted to live in peace. But I also find darker things. More rope, iron chains, wooden stakes sharpened to points. And everywhere, scattered among the household items, are small wooden crosses like the one I found yesterday. All of them burned. All of them stained with what might be blood. As the sun starts to set, the temperature drops rapidly. I build a fire and try to stay warm, but the cold seems to seep through my clothes and into my bones. That's when they start to appear. At first, it's just shapes moving between the trees. Dark figures that might be shadows or might be men in long coats and wide hats. They move slowly, deliberately, like they're searching for something. I add more wood to my fire and try to convince myself it's just my imagination. But the shapes become clearer as the darkness deepens. There are 5 of them. Tall, gaunt men dressed in black Puritan clothing. They carry ropes and wooden stakes and iron chains. Their faces are pale as bone, and their eyes burn with fanatic fire. One of them steps into the circle of light from my campfire. I recognize him immediately, the same man I saw yesterday, the one who called my name. "Ezekiel Grimshaw," I whisper. He nods slowly. "Descendant of my blood," he says. His voice sounds like wind through a graveyard. "You have come to complete the work we started." "I don't understand," I say, but even as the words leave my mouth, I think I do understand, and it terrifies me. "The devil's servants fled here," Ezekiel says. "They built their evil settlement in this godless place. We pursued them, as was our holy duty, but they used their dark magic against us." The other 4 men step closer. I can see their faces now, twisted with religious hatred and righteous anger. They look at me like I'm supposed to help them. "We died in this place," Ezekiel continues. But our work was not finished. The witches still practice their evil arts. They must be stopped. They must be judged. Those people were innocent, I say, standing up. My voice shakes, but I force myself to speak. They weren't witches. They were just families trying to escape persecution. Ezekiel's face twists with rage. Blasphemy! You speak the devil's words. The temperature drops so fast that my breath comes out in thick clouds. The fire flickers and nearly goes out. The 5 witch hunters move closer, surrounding me. You are of my blood, Ezekiel says. You will help us complete God's work. Tomorrow, the modern witches come to this place. They think to hold their evil ceremonies here. But we will be ready. Modern witches? I ask. Followers of the old ways. They call themselves Wiccans now, but we know what they truly are. They come to honor the devil's servants we failed to destroy. But you will help us judge them properly. My mind races. There must be some kind of Wiccan group planning to visit Raven's Hollow. Probably just people interested in nature, spirituality, completely harmless. But these spirits, these witch hunters, they want to hurt innocent people all over again. I won't help you, I say. Ezekiel's eyes flash with fury. You will. You are my blood. You have no choice. One of the other spirits raises a rope, and I can see the noose tied at the end. They step closer, and I feel an overwhelming compulsion to obey. It's like their will is pressing down on my mind, trying to force me to agree with them. I stumble backward, fighting against the mental pressure. No, I gasp. I won't be part of this. The spirits move faster now, reaching for me with hands that look like bones wrapped in shadows. I grab a burning branch from my fire and swing it at them. The branch passes right through Ezekiel's body, but he recoils anyway. All 5 spirits step back, hissing like snakes. We cannot resist forever, Ezekiel says. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, the modern witches will come, and you will help us give them the justice they deserve. The spirits fade back into the shadows, but I can still feel them watching me, waiting. I don't sleep at all that night. I sit by my fire and stare into the darkness, knowing that tomorrow will bring a confrontation I'm not prepared for. But I also know I can't let these fanatical spirits hurt innocent people. Even if those people are just modern pagans or Wiccans or whoever they don't deserve to die for practicing a different religion. I'm going to have to find a way to stop my own ancestor, even if it kills me. The next day passes like a nightmare. I try to pack up and leave, but I can't. Every time I start walking toward the trail, something pulls me back. It's like invisible chains are holding me in the hollow. I realize the spirits won't let me go. They need me here for whatever they're planning. As evening approaches, I hear voices coming from the main trail. Real voices, this time, not ghostly ones. I count at least 4 people hiking toward the hollow. They're laughing and talking, completely unaware of the danger waiting for them. I try to run toward them, to warn them, but my legs won't obey me. The spiritual compulsion is getting stronger as darkness falls. The hiking group reaches the clearing just as the sun disappears behind the mountains. There are 5 of them. 3 women and 2 men, all in their 20s or 30s. They're carrying backpacks and what looks like ceremonial supplies. One of the women, a dark-haired lady with kind eyes, sees me sitting by my fire. "Oh, hello," she says. "We didn't know anyone else would be here. I'm Luna. Are you camping here too?" I try to speak, to warn her, but the words stick in my throat. The witch hunter's control over me is growing stronger by the minute. "We're here for a full moon ceremony," Luna continues. "This place has such powerful energy. We wanted to honor the spirits of the people who died here long ago. If only she knew how right she was about the spirits." Luna and her friends start setting up their own camp on the other side of the clearing. They're Wiccans, just like the witch hunters said, but they seem like good people. They talk quietly among themselves, respectful of the natural environment and the history of the place. As the moon rises, they begin their ceremony. It's nothing evil or scary, just people holding hands in a circle, saying prayers to nature spirits, and lighting candles to honor the dead. That's when the witch hunters appear. All 5 of them step out of the shadows at once, their black clothes making them look like holes cut out of the night. They carry their ropes and stakes and chains, and their eyes burn with holy fire. The Wiccans see them and gasp. One of the men tries to step protectively in front of Luna, but Ezekiel raises his hand and the man freezes in place. Devil worshippers, Ezekiel says, his voice echoing across the clearing. You come to this unholy place to practice your dark arts. But the Lord's justice has finally arrived. We're not devil worshippers, Luna says, her voice shaking but brave. We're just honoring nature and remembering the people who died here. Lies, another witch hunter spits. The same lies your ancestors told before we purged them from this earth. I try to move, to help the Wiccans, but my body won't respond. The spiritual compulsion holds me like iron chains. Ezekiel turns to me. Descendant of my blood, he says, you will judge these devil servants. You will pronounce their guilt and sentence them to death. No, I manage to whisper. You have no choice. You are of Grimshaw blood. You will complete what I started. The pressure in my head builds until I think my skull might crack. I can feel Ezekiel's will trying to overwhelm my own thoughts. For a moment, I almost give in. It would be so easy to just agree, to do what he wants. But then I look at Luna and her friends. They're terrified but still trying to protect each other. They're innocent people who just want to practice their beliefs in peace, just like the refugees who came here 300 years ago. No, I say louder. I won't do it. Ezekiel's face twists with rage. You will obey. The spiritual pressure increases tenfold. I fall to my knees, clutching my head. Blood runs from my nose. But somehow, I find the strength to speak. I know what really happened here. I gasp. I've read the records. I've seen the artifacts. You murdered innocent families. You killed children because you were afraid of people who believed differently than you. They were witches, Ezekiel screams. They were refugees. They were trying to escape persecution, and you followed them here and slaughtered them. The other witch hunters moved toward the Wiccans, raising their ropes and stakes. Luna and her friends huddled together, unable to move because of the spirit's power. I force myself to stand up, fighting against every ounce of spiritual compulsion. I am Jonathan Grimshaw, I shout. I am your descendant, and I renounce everything you stand for. Ezekiel staggers backward like I'd hit him with a physical blow. I renounce your hatred, I continue. I renounce your fanaticism. I renounce your murder of innocent people. The other witch hunters begin to waver, their forms becoming less solid. The people who died here deserve justice, I say, but not the kind of justice you gave them. They deserve to be remembered as victims, not villains. They deserve to have their names cleared. You cannot, Ezekiel gasps. You are my blood. Yes, I am, and that means I have the power to end this. I formally apologize to the spirits of everyone you killed. I acknowledge their innocence, and I use my authority as your descendant to order you to leave this place forever. Ezekiel lets out a scream of rage and despair that echoes through the hollow like a wind from hell. The other witch hunters begin to fade, their forms dissolving into mist. This is not over, Ezekiel snarls. Evil will always need to be purged from the earth. Maybe, I say, but you're not the one to do it. You had your chance, and you chose hatred over justice. Now it's time for you to rest. Ezekiel reaches for me one last time, but his hand passes through my body like smoke. Then, he too fades away, and the 5 witch hunters are gone. The spiritual pressure lifts all at once. Luna and her friends collapse to the ground, gasping and sobbing. I run to them to make sure they're okay. What were those things? Luna asks. The spirits of men who died here 300 years ago, I tell her. Men who couldn't let go of their hatred, even in death. Are they gone now? I look around the clearing. The oppressive feeling is gone. The temperature is normal again. Even the trees seem less dark and threatening. Yes, I say. They're gone. But I can still feel something in this place. Not the angry spirits of the witch hunters, but something else. Something peaceful and grateful. The spirits of the refugees, the innocent people who died here. They're finally at rest. The Wiccans pack up and leave the next morning, still shaken by what they experienced. Luna gives me her contact information and asks me to let her know what I discover about the history of the place. I spend 2 more days completing my archaeological survey. Now that the witch hunters are gone, the work goes smoothly. I find evidence of at least 12 families who lived in the hollow, men, women, and children who just wanted to practice their beliefs in peace. I also find a mass grave. The remains are scattered and incomplete, probably disturbed by animals over the centuries. But the bones tell a clear story. These people were murdered. Many show signs of hanging or burning. Some are small bones that belong to children. I document everything carefully and respectfully. These people deserve to have their story told properly, not through the distorted lens of witch trial hysteria. When I get back to civilization, I file my report with the National Park Service. I recommend that Ravens Hollow be designated as a historic site and a memorial to religious persecution in colonial America. I also write a detailed academic paper about the massacre, using primary source documents to prove that the victims were innocent refugees, not witches. The paper gets published in the Journal of Colonial History and causes quite a stir in academic circles. Some historians argue with my conclusions, but the evidence is too strong to ignore. Slowly, the official story begins to change. The people who died in Ravens Hollow are finally being recognized as victims rather than villains. 3 months later, I return to the Hollow with a team from the university. We're installing a memorial plaque and conducting a proper burial ceremony for the remains we found. Luna and several other Wiccans come to the ceremony. They say prayers for the dead and leave flowers on the memorial. It feels right to have them there. Their beliefs aren't so different from what the refugees probably practiced. A connection to nature and respect for the cycles of life and death. The Hollow feels completely different now. The trees seem greener, the air cleaner. Birds nest in the branches again, and I even see a family of ravens watching from a nearby pine tree. The angry spirits are gone, but sometimes I still feel the presence of the refugees. Not frightening or demanding, just peaceful. Like they're grateful someone finally told their real story. I've changed too. I can't look at historical persecution the same way anymore. It's not just something that happened long ago to people I never met. It's something that echoes through time, affecting generation after generation, until someone has the courage to break the cycle. I've made it my mission to find other sites like Ravens Hollow, places where innocent people were killed because of fear and prejudice. I want to give them proper memorials and tell their real stories, because I learned something important in that hollow. The dead don't always rest easy, especially when they've been wronged. But sometimes, if you're willing to stand up for what's right, you can help them find peace, and maybe, just maybe, you can prevent their suffering from being repeated. The last entry in my field journal from Ravens Hollow reads, "Some family legacies are worth breaking. Some ancestors' work is worth undoing. Truth and justice matter more than blood loyalty. The innocent deserve to be remembered as innocent." I think about that every day now. In my work, in my life, in the choices I make about right and wrong. Because in the end, we're all responsible for the kind of legacy we leave behind. And I refuse to let mine be built on the suffering of innocent people. The ravens have returned to Ravens Hollow. But now they're not scavengers, they're guardians, watching over a place where justice finally won over hatred. That's how I know the spirits are truly at rest. My name is Marcus Bridgewater, but everyone calls me Mark. I've been a park ranger for 14 years now, working in the Daniel Boone National Forest here in Kentucky. Most folks think being a ranger is all about bears and camping permits, but my specialty is something different. I manage old railroad corridors and turn them into hiking trails. The work suits me fine. My grandfather worked the railroads his whole life, and I grew up hearing stories about steam engines and mountain passes. He died before I was born, back in 1943, but my dad always said I had railroad iron in my blood. December 1988 was when everything changed. I was tasked with converting an abandoned railroad line through a place called Devil's Bend into a recreational trail. The railroad had been dead for over 40 years, but the route cut through some of the prettiest mountain country you ever saw. Steel trestle bridges crossed deep hollows, and old tunnels bored straight through solid rock. The project should have been simple. Survey the 15-mile corridor, remove dangerous debris, grade the old roadbed for hiking. We had federal funding and a good crew led by Bill Hawkins, a construction foreman who'd worked these mountains his whole life. But from day one, something felt wrong. Bill called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with confusion. "Mark, you need to get up here. Something's not right." I drove the 20 miles of winding mountain road to reach the old depot at Devil's Bend. The building was just a shell now, broken windows and sagging roof, but it still looked like a train might pull up any minute. Bill met me by his truck, shaking his head. "Equipment's been moved," he said. "All of it. Every piece." I looked around the worksite. His bulldozer sat 50 yards from where he'd parked it. The grading equipment was lined up in a perfect row beside the old tracks. Even the tool trailer had been relocated. "Kids playing pranks?" I asked. Bill spat into the gravel. "Mark, that dozer weighs 8 tons. And look." He pointed to the ground around the machines. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. He was right. The December ground was soft from recent rains, but there wasn't a mark anywhere. The equipment looked like it had been picked up and set down by invisible hands. "Maybe you parked it different than you remember," I said, but even as I spoke, I didn't believe it. That's when we heard it. A whistle. Low and mournful, echoing off the mountain walls. It sounded like a train whistle, but there hadn't been trains through Devil's Bend since the 1,940 seconds. Bill went pale. "You hear that?" The whistle came again, longer this time. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing between the ridges until you couldn't tell which direction it started from. "Wind through the bridge supports," I said. "Steel creates funny sounds." But I knew that wasn't right either. I'd worked around enough old railroad structures to know what wind sounded like through metal. This was different. This sounded like a real train whistle, operated by human hands. We spent the rest of the day surveying the route. The old railroad bed was in better shape than I'd expected. Most of the rails had been pulled up for scrap years ago, but the road bed was solid. The 3 trestle bridges would need safety railings, but their bones were good. It was near the second bridge that I found the first really strange thing. Bill had gone back to move equipment, so I was alone, taking measurements for the trail surface. The winter light was fading fast, and I was hurrying to finish before dark. That's when I saw fresh flowers by the trackside. Not wildflowers, store-bought flowers. Red roses, still bright and fresh, laid out in a perfect line along where the rails used to be. There must have been 20 arrangements, each one placed exactly where a railroad tie would have sat. I picked up one of the bouquets. The flowers were real, still damp with dew, but we were 20 miles from the nearest paved road, and there hadn't been any visitors to the site. Who would hike all this way to leave flowers on an abandoned railroad? More puzzling was what I found underneath each bouquet. Military dog tags, old ones, from World War II. The metal was tarnished but readable. Different names on each tag, but all showing the same date. The 15th of December, 1943. I gathered up several of the tags and headed back to my truck. The whistle sounded again as I walked, closer now and more urgent. For just a moment, I could swear I heard something else mixed in with it, voices calling out, like men shouting warnings. But when I stopped to listen, there was only the wind through the bare trees and the creak of old steel in the cold. That night, I drove to the county library in town and spent hours going through old newspapers. What I found made my blood run cold. The 15th of December, 1943. A military transport train carrying 9 soldiers had derailed at Devil's Bend. The engine and 3 cars had gone off the trestle bridge, plunging into the hollow below. Every soldier aboard was killed. The newspaper called it a tragic accident, but reading between the lines, I could see something else. There were mentions of equipment failure and railroad company negligence. The railroad had been cutting corners during the war, running trains too fast on tracks that needed repair. But what really got my attention was a single line in the casualty list. Private Harold Bridgewater, age 23, of Harlan County, Kentucky. My grandfather. I barely slept that night. The name in the newspaper kept running through my mind. Harold Bridgewater, 1943. My dad had never told me how Grandpa died, just that it was during the war. I'd always assumed he died overseas, fighting the Germans or Japanese. But he died right here, 20 miles from where I'd grown up, on the same railroad. In line I was now supposed to turn into a hiking trail. The next morning, I called my dad. "You never told me Grandpa died in a train wreck," I said. Long silence on the other end. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice heavy. "Wasn't something we talked about. Your grandmother made us promise never to speak of it." "Why?" "Because she blamed herself. She'd begged him not to take that transport assignment. Harold was a railroad man, not a soldier, but they needed someone who knew the mountain routes. She said if she'd fought harder, he'd have stayed home. Dad, there were 89 men on that train. All of them died. I know, son. That's why we don't talk about it. After hanging up, I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the old depot. Everything felt different now. This wasn't just another trail project. This was where my grandfather had died. Bill and his crew arrived around 8, but their equipment troubles started immediately. The bulldozer wouldn't start, even though it had run fine the day before. When they finally got it going, the engine kept cutting out every time they approached the spot where I'd found the flowers. Fuel line's probably dirty, Bill said, but he didn't sound convinced. By lunch, 3 different machines had malfunctioned. Each time, it happened in the same area, a quarter-mile stretch of roadbed near the second trestle bridge. Maybe we should work a different section today, I suggested. Bill nodded, clearly relieved. We moved the operation 2 miles down the line, near the old depot. The equipment ran perfectly. But that afternoon, things got stranger. I was walking the depot platform, checking the foundation for trail markers, when I heard footsteps inside the building. Slow, measured steps, like someone pacing back and forth. The depot had been empty for 40 years. There were no doors anymore, just openings where doors used to be. I would have seen anyone go inside. I called out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, but heard nothing more. Finally, I walked through the main entrance. The depot was empty, just like it should be. Broken glass, old newspapers, graffiti on the walls. But the dust on the floor showed clear boot prints. Military boots, by the look of them. The prints went back and forth across the room, then stopped in the center where a soldier might have stood at attention. I knelt to examine the prints more closely. They were fresh, made within the last few minutes. The tread pattern was old-fashioned, nothing like modern work boots. That's when I noticed the cold spot. The temperature inside the depot was maybe 40 degrees, but right where the footprints ended, it felt like a freezer. My breath came out in white puffs, and ice crystals formed on my jacket. I stood up quickly and backed toward the entrance. As I did, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl, the scratching of a pencil on paper. On the old ticket counter, a pencil was moving by itself, writing on a piece of paper that hadn't been there moments before. I watched, frozen, as words appeared in neat military handwriting. Train delayed, equipment failure, 89 souls aboard. The pencil stopped. The paper burst into flames and crumbled to ash in seconds. I ran. Bill found me by my truck, breathing hard and white as a sheet. "What happened?" he asked. I told him about the footprints and the writing. He listened without interrupting, his face growing more concerned. "Mark," he said finally, "maybe we should call this project off. We can't. We've got federal funding, environmental approvals, everything. We've also got something that doesn't want us here." That evening, I drove to the nearest town with a library and spent hours researching the 1943 wreck. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The railroad company had known the tracks were dangerous. Engineers had filed reports about loose rails and weak bridge supports. But the company ignored them. They were making too much money hauling military cargo to stop for repairs. The train that crashed was carrying soldiers being transferred from a base in Georgia to a port in Virginia. They were heading overseas, most of them just kids, 19 and 20 years old. The train was running 2 hours behind schedule, so the company ordered the engineer to go faster to make up time. When the engine hit the bad section of track at 60 miles per hour instead of the safe speed of 25, the result was inevitable. The locomotive jumped the rails and went through the bridge railing like it was made of paper. The cars followed, tumbling into the hollow in a twisted pile of metal and steam. Rescue workers said you could hear the screaming from miles away, but it only lasted a few minutes. Most of the soldiers died on impact. What really bothered me was what happened after. The railroad company paid off investigators and newspapers to call it an accident. They buried the evidence of their negligence along with the dead soldiers. The families never learned the truth. 89 young men died because someone wanted to save money on track repairs and make up time on a schedule. They died for nothing, and then their deaths were covered up to protect corporate profits. I understood now why the flowers appeared by the trackside. Someone was trying to honor those soldiers, someone who knew they deserved better than an unmarked grave in an abandoned hollow. The question was, who was leaving the flowers, and why could I hear footsteps in an empty building? As I drove back to Devil's Bend in the dark, I started to suspect I already knew the answer. But I wasn't ready to believe it yet. The whistle sounded as I reached the depot, long and mournful in the winter night. This time, I was close enough to tell exactly where it came from. The sound was coming from the trestle bridge where the train had crashed 45 years ago. But there was no train on that bridge. There was no train anywhere. The next morning brought the first real snow of winter. Bill's crew was nervous, talking in low voices and glancing at the depot like it might bite them. Word had gotten around about the equipment problems and strange sounds. Maybe we should wait for spring, suggested Tom, one of the younger workers. Can't, I said. We've got deadlines. Federal money comes with federal schedules. But I was starting to wish we could postpone. The night before, I'd called the State Historical Society and learned something that made my skin crawl. According to their records, the bodies of the soldiers had never been properly recovered from the wreck site. The railroad company had simply dumped tons of dirt and rock over the crashed cars, turning the hollow into a makeshift grave. 89 soldiers were still down there, buried under 40 years of mud and debris. We decided to work on the far end of the route, away from the bridge and depot. But even there, things weren't normal. Bill was using a metal detector to locate old spikes and rail hardware when the machine started going crazy. It beeped and squealed like it had found the mother lode, but when we dug, there was nothing there. Just dirt and rocks. Detector's broken, Bill said, but when we moved 50 yards away, it worked fine. We tried 3 different metal detectors. Same result. They all went haywire in certain spots along the old roadbed, but found nothing when we investigated. I was marking the locations on my survey map when I noticed a pattern. The metal detectors were reacting every 32 feet, exactly the spacing of railroad ties. But the ties had been removed decades ago. It's like the rails are still there, Tom said, wiping sweat from his face despite the cold. Like the detectors are seeing something we can't. The afternoon, while the crew worked on clearing brush, I hiked down into the hollow below the trestle bridge. I'd been avoiding this area, but I needed to see the wreck site for myself. The hollow was deeper than it looked from above. 40-year-old trees grew thick on the slopes, but at the bottom, in a rough circle about 50 feet across, nothing grew at all. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard as concrete. I walked the perimeter of the dead zone, trying to imagine what it looked like in 1943. The train would have hit right here. The engine driving deep into the soft earth. The cars would have telescoped behind it, crushing everything inside. That's when I saw the first bone. It was sticking up through the dirt near the center of the circle, a human arm bone, yellowed with age. As I looked closer, I saw more. Ribs, leg bones, pieces of skull. The winter rains had washed away enough dirt to expose parts of the mass grave. But these weren't the only bones. Mixed in with the human remains were pieces of military equipment, helmets, belt buckles, buttons from uniforms, and everywhere, scattered like confetti, were dog tags. I gathered up a handful of the tags, reading the names. Different soldiers, different hometowns, but all with the same date. The 15th of December, 1943. As I worked, the temperature dropped. My breath started coming out in white puffs, and ice began forming on the metal in my hands. The woods around the hollow went completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. That's when I heard the voices. They started as whispers, so faint I thought it might be wind in the trees. But gradually they grew louder, and I could make out words. Help us, so cold. Want to go home. Tell our families. The voices were young, scared. They sounded like boys calling for their mothers. I looked around the hollow, but saw nothing. The voices seemed to come from the ground itself, from the dirt where the soldiers were. Buried. Who's there? I called out. The voices stopped. The silence stretched on until I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, one voice spoke clearly, close enough that it might have been standing right beside me. Harold's grandson. I dropped the dog tags and ran. By the time I reached my truck, I was shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. The voices had known who I was. They had recognized me. I drove straight to town and spent the evening in the library, reading everything I could find about the soldiers who died in the crash. Most were just kids. 18 and 19 years old, farm boys from Kentucky and Tennessee, city kids from Ohio and Pennsylvania. They'd been drafted to fight in a war, but they'd died before they ever saw a battlefield. Harold Bridgewater, my grandfather, had been the oldest at 23. According to his service record, he'd volunteered to ride the train because he knew the mountain routes. He was supposed to help navigate the dangerous curves and steep grades. Instead, he died with all the rest when the train company's greed sent them off the bridge. I was closing the library when I found the most disturbing piece of information. In a 1944 follow-up article, buried on page 6, there was a single paragraph about the families of the dead soldiers. They had never been given the bodies for burial. The railroad company claimed the wreckage was too dangerous to excavate, so the soldiers were left where they fell. 89 families never got to say goodbye to their sons. 89 mothers never got to put flowers on their boys' graves. That night, I lay awake thinking about the voices in the hollow. Young soldiers, scared and calling for help, still trapped after 45 years, still waiting for someone to care enough to bring them home. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of working on the trail, I was going back to the hollow with a proper excavation kit. If those boys wanted to be found, I was going to find them. Bill tried to talk me out of it. "Mark, that's not our job. We're supposed to build a trail, not dig up old graves." "Those aren't just old graves," I said. "Those are American soldiers. They deserve better than being buried under railroad company dirt." I spent the day in the hollow, carefully excavating and cataloging what I found. It was slow, careful work. Every bone, every piece of equipment, every personal item had to be documented and preserved. But as I worked, strange things began happening. The metal detector I'd brought kept changing its readings, even when I wasn't moving it. Sometimes it would beep out patterns that almost sounded like Morse code. The temperature stayed unnaturally cold, even though the sun was shining and there was no wind. Ice formed on my tools despite the 40-degree weather. And throughout the day, I felt like I was being watched. Several times, I turned around expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the hollow was always empty. Still, the feeling persisted. Dozens of eyes watching my every move. By late afternoon, I had uncovered parts of 8 different soldiers. Each skeleton was incomplete, scattered by 40 years of erosion and animal activity. But with each discovery, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was near sunset when I found something that made me stop cold. Half buried under a rotted piece of railroad timber, I found a wallet. The leather was cracked and stained, but it had survived the decades underground. Inside was a military ID card with a photograph. The face looking back at me from the faded picture was my own. Not exactly, but close enough to be my brother. Same dark hair, same jawline, same eyes. According to the ID, this was Private Harold Bridgewater, age 23. My grandfather. I was still staring at the photograph when the whistle sounded. This time, it wasn't distant or echoing. It was right above me, on the trestle bridge. I looked up to see a sight that defied everything I knew about reality. A train was crossing the bridge. Not a solid train, but a ghost train. I could see through it, but every detail was perfectly clear. A steam locomotive from the 1942nd, pulling 3 passenger cars. Smoke poured from the stack, and sparks flew from the wheels on the rails. But there were no rails on that bridge. They'd been removed 40 years ago. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, the phantom train reached the center of the bridge, the exact spot where the real train had derailed in 1943. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then, with a grinding shriek of metal and a chorus of terrified screams, the ghost train reenacted the crash. The locomotive tilted, left the invisible rails, and plunged toward the hollow where I stood. I dove aside as the phantom engine crashed into the earth beside me, passing through the ground like smoke. The passenger cars followed, tumbling and twisting in a perfect replay of the 1943 disaster. For 10 seconds, the hollow was filled with the sounds of destruction, screaming metal, breaking glass, and most horrible of all, the cries of dying men. Then, silence. I lay on the ground, heart pounding, staring at the empty air where the phantom train had been. Nothing remained but the scattered bones of the real victims. As I struggled to my feet, I heard one last sound. A voice, clear and strong, speaking from somewhere very close. Time to bring us home, grandson." That night, I didn't go home. I sat in my truck at the edge of the hollow, thinking about what I'd seen and what it meant. The ghost train wasn't just a supernatural curiosity, it was a message. Those soldiers had been trying to tell me something ever since I started the project. The moved equipment, the footsteps in the depot, the voices in the hollow, they weren't trying to scare me away. They were trying to get my attention. They wanted to be found. They wanted to go home. Around midnight, I walked back into the depot. The building felt different now, not threatening, but expectant, like a room full of people waiting for someone to speak. "I know you're here," I said to the empty air. "I know what you want." The temperature dropped immediately. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost began forming on the broken windows. Then they appeared. At first, just shadows moving in the corners of my vision. But gradually, they became more solid. Dozens of young men in 1942nd military uniforms standing at attention throughout the depot. They looked exactly like the old photographs I'd seen. Fresh-faced boys who should have been home dating girls and playing baseball instead of riding trains to war. But their faces were marked by the violence of their deaths. Some showed crushing injuries, others burns from the steam. In the center of the group stood a soldier I recognized from the photograph in the wallet, Harold Bridgewater. My grandfather. He stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "You look like your father did at your age," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud." I wanted to answer, but no words came. This was impossible, but it was happening. "We've been waiting," Harold continued, "waiting for someone to care enough to bring us home. We knew it would be family that came for us." "I don't understand," I managed to say. "Why me? Why now?" "Because you were building something over our graves. Because you have railroad in your blood. Because you're the only one who would listen." Around the depot, the other soldiers moved closer. I could see their faces clearly now, young, eager, hopeful. They didn't look angry or vengeful. They looked like boys who wanted to see their mothers. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "Tell the truth," Harold said. "Tell the world how we died. Make sure we get proper burials, with full military honors. Make sure our families know we didn't die for nothing. It's been 45 years. Most of your families are probably dead." "Yes. But their children and grandchildren are alive. They deserve to know what happened to us. They deserve to know we served our country, even if we died before we reached the war." I understood. These soldiers had been erased from history, covered up by corporate lawyers and bought investigators. Their families had lived with questions for decades, never knowing exactly how their sons and brothers had died. "I'll do everything I can," I promised. Harold smiled. "I know you will. You're a Bridgewater." The other soldiers stepped forward, and each one told me his name and hometown. I repeated every one, committing them to memory. They were no longer just casualties in an old newspaper. They were people, real young men, with families who had loved them and mourned them. As the last soldier spoke his name, the temperature in the depot began to rise. The phantoms started to fade, becoming translucent again. "Wait," I called out. "Will I see you again?" Harold paused at the edge of visibility. "When we're properly buried, we'll rest. Until then, we'll be here, waiting." They vanished, leaving me alone in the cold depot. The next morning, I called Bill and told him to suspend all work on the trail project. Instead, I was bringing in forensic archaeologists and military historians. We were going to do this right. "Mark, that's going to cost a fortune," Bill said. "The government's not going to pay for a full excavation." "Then I'll pay for it myself." "With what money?" I hadn't thought about that. Park rangers don't make much, and a proper archaeological dig would cost thousands. But I'd made a promise to 89 dead soldiers, and I intended to keep it. That's when I remembered Colonel James Morrison, a retired military historian who lived in Lexington. I'd met him at a conference years before, and he specialized in World War II transportation accidents. I called him that afternoon and told him the whole story. The trail project, the strange occurrences, and what I'd found in the hollow. I expected him to think I was crazy. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years. "What do you mean?" "I've known about Devil's Bend since I was a young officer. The Army tried to investigate the crash back in 1943. But the railroad company blocked us at every turn. They had politicians in their pocket, judges on their payroll. We never got justice for those boys. Are you saying the Army would support an excavation? Son, the Army would do a hell of a lot more than that. Those soldiers died in service to their country. They deserve full military honors, proper burial, and recognition for their sacrifice. If you can prove they're there, I can get the Pentagon involved. 2 days later, Colonel Morrison arrived with a team of military archaeologists and a portable ground-penetrating radar unit. What they found in the hollow confirmed everything I'd suspected. The radar showed the clear outline of railroad cars buried under tons of debris. More importantly, it showed human remains, dozens of them, arranged in the rough pattern you'd expect from a passenger train crash. This is definitely the crash site, Morrison said, studying the radar printouts. And those are definitely human remains. We're looking at the largest American military grave site that's never been properly excavated. Over the next week, Morrison pulled strings I didn't know existed. Within days, we had official Army support, federal funding, and a full excavation team. The trail project was officially suspended and converted into a military recovery operation. The excavation took 6 weeks. Working carefully and respectfully, the team recovered the remains of all 89 soldiers, along with personal effects, equipment, and parts of the train itself. But the most amazing discovery came near the end of the dig. Buried under the locomotive cab, the archaeologists found a military telegraph key and a partial message that had been tapped out just before the crash. The last communication from the doomed train was a warning to other trains on the line. Track unsafe. Stop all traffic. Equipment failure imminent. Even as their train was derailing, my grandfather and the other railroad personnel had tried to save lives by warning others about the dangerous conditions. The telegram proved that the soldiers had known they were in danger and had died trying to prevent other disasters. It also proved that the railroad company had received the warning and ignored it, allowing other trains to use the same dangerous track. Colonel Morrison called it the smoking gun that finally proved what everyone had suspected for 45 years. The railroad company had deliberately ignored safety warnings and caused the deaths of 89 American soldiers. The military funeral for the 89 soldiers took place on a crisp morning in March 1989. The ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery, with full honors and representatives from every branch of the armed forces. I stood with the families who had come, children and grandchildren of the dead soldiers, some meeting each other for the first time. Many of them had spent their entire lives wondering what happened to their fathers and grandfathers. Now they knew. Their loved ones had died serving their country, and they had died as heroes, trying to save others even in their final moments. My own family was there. My father, my aunts and uncles, cousins I'd never met. We finally had closure for a wound that had festered in our family for 46 years. As the honor guard fired the 21-gun salute, I felt a presence beside me. Not visible, but unmistakably there. My grandfather's spirit, finally at peace. The investigation that followed the discovery made national news. The evidence we'd found led to a congressional inquiry into the 1,943 cover-up. Several major newspapers published exposés about corporate negligence during wartime, and the railroad company, now owned by a larger corporation, was forced to pay substantial settlements to the families of the victims. More importantly, new safety regulations were enacted to prevent similar accidents. The 89 soldiers who died at Devil's Bend finally got the justice they deserved. The trail project was redesigned as a memorial route. Instead of just a hiking trail, we created an interpretive path that told the story of the 1,943 disaster and honored the soldiers who died there. The old depot was restored as a visitors center, with exhibits about the crash and the men who lost their lives. At the trestle bridge, we built a memorial platform where visitors can look down into the hollow where the train crashed. A bronze plaque lists all 89 names, and fresh flowers appear there regularly, left by visitors who want to honor the soldiers' sacrifice. The trail officially opened on the 15th of December 1989, exactly 46 years after the crash. Thousands of people have visited since then, including many family members of the victims. The Devil's Bend Memorial Trail has become one of the most popular destinations in the Daniel Boone National Forest. But the most remarkable thing about the trail is what doesn't happen there anymore. There are no strange equipment failures. No phantom train whistles. No cold spots or ghostly footsteps. The soldiers of Devil's Bend have finally found peace. Well, almost. Sometimes, usually on quiet winter evenings, visitors report hearing something unusual on the trail. Not screams or warning whistles, but something much more comforting. The sound of young men talking and laughing together, like soldiers on leave sharing stories and jokes. They say the voices sound happy. As for me, I've continued working as a park ranger, but my focus has shifted. I specialize now in locating and preserving other forgotten military sites throughout the National Forest System. It's amazing how many stories are out there, waiting to be discovered by someone who cares enough to listen. I've learned that the dead don't always rest easy, especially when they died unjustly or were forgotten by history. But they're not malevolent. They just want to be remembered. They want their stories told, and their sacrifices honored. The soldiers at Devil's Bend taught me that sometimes the most important part of a park ranger's job isn't protecting the living, it's speaking for the dead. Every year on December 15th, I return to the Memorial Trail and spend the day at the Trestle Bridge. I bring fresh flowers and read the names aloud, all 89 of them. It's my way of making sure they're never forgotten again. And every year, as I read the last name on the list, Private Harold Bridgewater, age 23, of Harlan County, Kentucky, I feel that familiar presence beside me. My grandfather, proud that his grandson kept his promise. The railroad phantoms of Devil's Bend are at rest now. But their legacy lives on in the memorial that honors their service and the truth that finally set them free. Sometimes, when the mountain wind blows through the steel of the old trestle bridge, you can still hear it singing, but it doesn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounds like a lullaby. My name is Vincent Holloway, and I've been a forest ranger for 19 years. In that time, I've pulled 73 people out of the woods alive. Lost hikers, injured climbers, folks who thought they knew these mountains better than they did. I've seen broken bones, hypothermia, panic attacks, and plain old stupidity. What I hadn't seen, until October of 1978, was something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the George Washington National Forest. I work the Laurel Fork Wilderness in Virginia, 8,000 acres of some of the most remote country on the East Coast. It's the kind of place where you can walk for days without seeing another soul, where the rhododendron grows so thick you need a machete to get through, and where folks have been getting lost since before there were maps to lose them with. My family's been in these mountains for 4 generations. My great-grandfather settled here after the Civil War, my grandfather logged these hills, and my daddy taught me to read the land like a book. I thought I knew every hollow, every ridge, every creek that runs through this wilderness. But there was one place I'd never spent much time in, a deep hollow about 8 miles from the nearest trail, where the old maps show a settlement that's been gone for near a century. That's where this story starts. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-October when Margaret Steele, my district supervisor, called me into the office. Margaret's been running this district for 12 years, and she doesn't spook easy. But she looked troubled when she handed me the incident report. "Got a complaint from a backpacker," she said, pouring coffee that looked like motor oil. "Name's David Chen from Richmond. Says he was camping up in the Laurel Fork area near the old Whitlock settlement." I knew the place she meant. The Whitlock settlement was marked on the old survey maps, but there wasn't much left of it now. Just some foundation stones and a family. The cemetery that the Forest Service kept cleared as a historical site. "What kind of complaint?" I asked, though I figured I knew. "Probably saw some marijuana growers or got spooked by a bear." Margaret handed me Chen's written statement. I read it twice before I looked up at her. "He says a family was watching him sleep?" "That's what he says. Whole family, standing at the edge of his campsite all night, man, woman, 3 children, just watching. When he woke up in the morning, they were gone. But his gear had been moved around, everything folded neat and tidy, like his mother had come through and cleaned up." I set the paper down. "Margaret, this sounds like—" "I know what it sounds like. But Chen's not some weekend warrior. He's got military background, does search and rescue work down in Richmond. Not the type to make up stories or get rattled by shadows." She was right about that. I'd met Chen once before, when he'd helped us find a lost kid 2 summers back. solid guy, good in the woods, not given to flights of fancy. You want me to check it out? I want you to hike up there and see if there's anyone camping illegal, maybe some folks living rough who might be bothering people. Chen filed a complaint, so we have to follow up. Besides, she paused, looking uncomfortable. This isn't the first report we've had from that area. That got my attention. What do you mean? 3 other incidents in the past 2 years. Different people, same general area, same basic story, families watching them, gear getting moved around. I didn't put it together until Chen's report came in. Margaret pulled out a thin file folder and spread 3 more incident reports on her desk. I read through them quick. Same story, different details. A couple from Pennsylvania reported a family in old-fashioned clothes watching their tent for hours. A solo hiker from Maryland woke up to find his pack completely reorganized. Another camper reported voices, singing hymns in the woods all night, but when he went to investigate in the morning, there was nobody there. Could be somebody playing pranks? I said, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The area was too remote, too hard to get to. And who would go to that kind of trouble just to mess with random campers? Could be, Margaret agreed. But we need to know for sure. I want you to go up there, spend a couple nights, see what you can see. Take your radio, follow standard protocols. If there's people living rough up there, we need to know about it. If there's something else. She trailed off. Something else, like what? Margaret looked out the window at the mountains. Vincent, you know these woods better than anyone. In all your time out there, have you ever seen anything you couldn't explain? I thought about that question as I packed my gear that afternoon. 19 years in the forest, and yes, I'd seen some strange things. Lights in the sky that weren't planes or satellites, animal tracks that didn't match anything in the identification books, sounds in the woods that made the hair on my neck stand up. But I'd always found explanations, or at least convinced myself I had. The mountains are old, older than human memory. The Cherokee had stories about these hills, and so did my own family. Growing up, my grandfather used to tell tales about the Watcher's spirits that guarded certain places in the woods. But those were just stories, weren't they? Mountain folklore, the kind of thing people made up to explain what they didn't understand. As I loaded my pack into the truck, I thought about my brother Tommy. He died in these woods 15 years ago, in what the sheriff called a hunting accident. Tommy knew these mountains as well as I did, better maybe. He wouldn't have made the kind of mistake that gets you killed. But accidents happen, even to experienced hunters. That's what I told myself, anyway. The drive up to the trailhead took 40 minutes on Forest Service roads that got narrower and rougher with every mile. By the time I reached the parking area, the sun was starting to set behind the ridgeline, throwing long shadows across the valley below. I'd be hiking in by headlamp, which wasn't ideal, but I knew these trails. The first 3 miles were easy enough, following an old logging road that curved up through second-growth timber. My pack felt good on my shoulders, familiar weight that told me I was doing something I understood. I had my radio, my maps, my compass, everything I needed to spend a few days in the backcountry and solve this mystery. But as I got deeper into the woods, something started to feel wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The trail was where it should be, the blazes were visible in my flashlight beam, the sound of my boots on the ground was normal. But there was something missing. It took me another mile to figure out what it was. The woods were too quiet. October nights in the mountains should be full of sound, owls calling, small animals moving through the leaves, the distant howl of coyotes. But there was nothing, just my footsteps and my breathing, and a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I stopped and listened for a full minute. Nothing. Not even wind in the trees. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a routine investigation. I reached the old Whitlock settlement just after 10 o'clock. The beam of my flashlight picked out the foundation stones, first rectangular outlines where cabins had stood 100 years ago. The stones were fitted tight, the kind of work that lasts. These people had meant to stay. The family cemetery sat on a little rise above the foundations, maybe 30 graves marked with stones both carved and simple. Some of the names were still readable. Whitlock, Morrison, Cole. The dates I could make out ranged from the 1,860 seconds to the 1,890 seconds, then nothing. Whatever had happened here, it had happened all at once. I set up my camp about 50 yards from the cemetery, following standard backcountry protocols. Level ground, away from water, with clear sight lines in all directions. I've made camp in these woods hundreds of times, and I've got the routine down to a science. But that night, every little task felt harder than it should have. My hands were shaking as I set up my tent, though I couldn't figure out why. The temperature was dropping, but not enough to explain the tremor in my fingers. And that silence was getting to me. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the wilderness, but I'd never experienced quiet like this. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I got my camp set up and my gear organized, then tried to raise Margaret on the radio for my evening check-in. Static. I adjusted the antenna, checked my battery, tried different frequencies. Nothing but white noise. That was unusual, but not unheard of. These mountains could play hell with radio signals, especially down in the deep hollows. I made some notes in my field book. 10:47 p.m., camp established at Whitlock site. No signs of recent human activity. Radio contact, unsuccessful. ATT, possible atmospheric interference or terrain blocking. Standard stuff, the kind of observations I'd been making for 2 decades. But what I didn't write down was how wrong everything felt. How the beam of my flashlight seemed to die just a few feet from my tent, swallowed up by darkness thicker than it should have been. How my compass needle was spinning slowly in lazy circles instead of pointing north. How the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees every time I got close to the cemetery. I tried to sleep around midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me. I'd sit up and shine my light around the campsite, but there was never anything there. Just trees and shadows, and that oppressive quiet. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the singing. It started soft, so soft I thought I might be imagining it. A woman's voice, maybe 2 women, singing something that sounded like a hymn. The melody was sad and sweet, the kind of tune that gets stuck in your head, but I couldn't make out the words, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my tent. The singing continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed off the hills in ways that didn't make sense, bouncing back on itself until it sounded like a whole choir was hidden in the woods around me. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped instantly, like someone had thrown a switch. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I stood there for 5 minutes, listening, but there was nothing more. Eventually, I went back to my tent, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found the first real evidence that something strange was happening in the hollow. My gear had been moved. I'm a careful man, you have to be in my line of work. I know exactly where I put things, and I remember the way I left my campsite when I went to sleep. But when I woke up, everything had been rearranged. My boots, which I'd left beside the tent door, were sitting neatly side by side, about 10 feet away. My water bottles had been unscrewed, and the caps placed in a perfect line next to them. My spare socks, which I'd hung on a tree branch to air out, were folded and stacked on a flat rock. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. But everything had been touched, handled, organized by someone who cared enough to do it right. I checked the ground around my campsite for tracks. The soil was soft from recent rain, and it should have held prints if someone had been walking around my tent. But there was nothing. Just my own boot prints from the night before, and some small animal tracks that looked like squirrel or chipmunk. That's when I noticed something else wrong. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen ground this bare of wildlife sign. No deer tracks, no bear scat, no bird scratchings in the leaves. It was like every animal for miles around had packed up and left. I spent the day exploring the settlement area, looking for any sign of who might be living rough up here. I found the ruins of 6 cabins, a well that still held water, and what looked like the remains of a small church or meeting house. But there were no recent campsites, no trash, no evidence that anyone had been here in years. The cemetery gave me the most information. Most of the stones were readable, and they told a story I was starting to piece together. The Whitlock settlement had been home to about 30 families in the 1,880 seconds, but by 1895, the graves stopped. The last burial date I could find was October 1894, carved into a stone that marked the grave of a child named Sarah Morrison, age 7. What had happened in October of 1894? I made a mental note to check the historical records when I got back to town. As the day wore on, I started to feel watched. It was a familiar feeling from my years in the woods, that prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that tells you something has eyes on you. But usually when I felt watched, I could spot the watcher. A deer on a distant ridge, a hawk circling overhead, sometimes a bear checking me out from a safe distance. This was different. The feeling was constant, but I never saw anything. I'd spin around quick, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me, but there was never anything there. Just trees and rocks and shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The worst part was the cemetery. Every time I got within 20 feet of the graves, the temperature dropped like I'd walked into a walk-in cooler. My breath started coming out in little puffs, and the hair on my arms stood up. But step back a few yards, and the temperature was normal again. I told myself it was just the geography. Cemeteries were often built on high ground that caught the wind. Cold air settled in low places. There were logical explanations for everything I was experiencing. But logic didn't explain what happened that afternoon. I was examining one of the foundation stones, looking for any marks or carvings that might tell me more about the people who'd lived here, when I heard a child laugh, clear as a bell, right behind me. I spun around, and for just a second, I saw her. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing a long dress that looked like something from an old photograph. She had dark hair and pale skin, and she was standing beside one of the graves, looking right at me. She smiled and waved, like she was greeting an old friend. I blinked, and she was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I walked over to where I'd seen her, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing to show anyone had been there. Just a small gravestone that read, Sarah Morrison, beloved daughter, 1887 to 1894. The same grave I'd found that morning. The last burial in the cemetery. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. Tricks of light and shadow, my brain making patterns where there weren't any. But I knew what I'd seen, and I was starting to understand why the other campers had been so spooked. As evening approached, I made my second attempt to radio Margaret. Still nothing but static. I checked my equipment again, everything was working fine, but the radio waves just couldn't seem to get out of the hollow. I was trapped here with whatever was watching me, and the night was coming on fast. The second night was when things got serious. I'd learned my lesson from the night before, so I stayed awake. Sat in my tent with my back against the door, flashlight in one hand and my field notebook in the other, writing down everything I saw and heard. If something was going to happen, I wanted to document it. The singing started again around 1 in the morning, but this time it was different. Instead of the sad hymn from the night before, it was children's voices. 3 or 4 kids, singing what sounded like a nursery rhyme. The words were too faint to make out, but the melody was cheerful, almost playful. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light. And there, at the edge of the cemetery, I saw them. 3 children, holding hands in a circle, dancing around one of the graves. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the boys in knickers and suspenders, the girl in a long dress with a white pinafore. They moved like they were playing a game, spinning and laughing, completely solid and real in the moonlight. I grabbed my camera and tried to take a picture, but the flash wouldn't work. I checked the batteries, tried again. Nothing. The camera was dead, even though it had been working fine that morning. When I looked up again, the children were gone. But the singing continued for another 10 minutes, coming from different parts of the cemetery now, like the kids were running from grave to grave. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat in my tent, watching and listening, while things moved around outside. Footsteps in the leaves, quiet conversations too far away to understand, the sound of someone weeping softly near the old well. When dawn finally came, I found my gear had been rearranged again, but this time there was something new. A small bouquet of wildflowers had been placed on my sleeping bag, mountain laurel and wild roses, tied together with what looked like a strip of cloth torn from an old dress. The flowers were fresh, still damp with dew. But it was mid-October. These flowers shouldn't have been blooming anymore. I was starting to understand that I wasn't dealing with living people. But that understanding brought its own terror. If these weren't flesh and blood folks playing pranks, then what were they? And what did they want with me? I spent the third day trying to piece together the history of the settlement. I walked every foundation, examined every grave marker, looked for any clue that might explain what had happened here in 1894. The answer came from an unexpected source. I was sitting on a fallen log, eating lunch and trying to make sense of my notes, when I noticed something carved into the bark of a large oak tree near the cemetery. The carving was old, nearly grown over, but I could just make out the words, J. Holloway, Oct 1894. Holloway, my family name. My great-grandfather had been named Jacob Holloway. He'd settled in these mountains after the war, but I'd never heard any stories about him living up here in the remote hollows. According to family legend, he'd been a farmer, worked land down in the valley. But here was his name, carved into a tree in the middle of a settlement that had died in October 1894. That's when I started to get scared. Really scared. I tried the radio again, desperate now to reach Margaret and tell her what I'd found. The static was worse than ever, full of voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I adjusted the frequency, and for just a moment, the static cleared. I shouldn't have come back. A woman's voice said, clear, as if she was standing right next to me. Holloway blood. Time to pay. Then the static rushed back in, and I couldn't get anything else. I started packing my gear. I'd seen enough, documented enough. Whatever was happening in this hollow was connected to my family somehow, and I needed to get out and do some research before I came back. If I came back. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard horses coming up the trail. The sound was unmistakable, multiple horses moving at a walk, harness leather creaking, hooves striking stone. But that was impossible. There were no horse trails up here, and nobody used horses for backcountry travel anymore. The terrain was too rough, the trails too narrow. I grabbed my pack and moved toward the tree line, staying low. The sound was getting closer, and now I could hear voices too. Men's voices, talking low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something angry in the tone, something that made my skin crawl. Through the trees, I saw them coming up the old settlement trail. 8 or 9 men on horseback, dressed in dark clothes that looked like they belonged in an old Western movie. They had rifles across their saddles and grim expressions on their faces. Leading them was a man I somehow recognized, even though I'd never seen him before. He looked like me. Same build, same facial structure, same way of sitting a horse. And his eyes were cold and hard in a way that made me want to run. The riders stopped at the edge of the settlement, and the leader, the man who looked like me, pointed toward the cemetery. He said something to the others, and they all laughed. It was not a nice sound. I watched in horror as they dismounted and began walking among the foundations, calling out names. Whitlock, Morrison, come out and face what's coming to you. Their voices echoed off the hills, full of hatred and purpose. Then, one of them spotted something I couldn't see and gave a shout. The others gathered around him, and I heard a sound that chilled my blood, a woman screaming. Not a scream of surprise or fear, but of absolute terror, the kind of sound a person makes when they know they're about to die. The men were moving now, fast and purposeful, heading toward the far side of the settlement. And I could see figures running ahead of them, a man, a woman, 3 children, all dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes I'd been seeing. They were real, solid, casting shadows in the moonlight. But the moonlight was wrong. It was broad daylight where I stood, but the scene I was watching seemed to be happening at night. I was seeing something that had happened a long time ago, something terrible. The family, for that's what they were, clearly a family, ran toward the cemetery, but the horsemen cut them off. What happened next was so brutal I can't write it all down, even now. But I watched as those men, my ancestors among them, murdered that family in cold blood, shot them down like animals while they begged for mercy. When it was over, the leader, the man who looked like me, walked among the bodies. He said something I couldn't hear, then mounted his horse and led the others away, leaving the dead where they lay. The vision faded, and I was alone again in the sunny afternoon. But I understood now. I understood everything. The Whitlock settlement hadn't been abandoned. It had been destroyed. The families buried in the cemetery hadn't died of disease or accident. They'd been murdered by a group of men who included my own great-grandfather. And the spirits of those murdered families had been waiting here ever since, watching and guarding their graves, making sure the truth wasn't forgotten. That night, they came for me directly. I'd barely finished setting up my tent when they appeared, not gradually this time, but all at once, like actors stepping onto a stage. The entire murdered family stood at the edge of my campsite, just watching me with sad, patient eyes. The man was tall and thin, with dark hair and a beard. The woman was small and pretty, wearing a blue dress that might have been her best. The children stood between them, 2 boys and a girl, the same girl I'd seen waving at me the day before. They didn't speak, but I could feel what they wanted. They wanted me to know. They wanted me to understand what had been done to them, and who had done it. They wanted justice, or at least acknowledgement. But they also wanted something else. Something that made my blood run cold. They wanted me to stay. The man stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the hills like thunder. "Jacob Holloway's blood," he said. "Come back to face judgment." I tried to run then, grabbed my pack and my flashlight and ran for the trail like the devil himself was chasing me. But I only made it about 50 yards before I slammed into something I couldn't see. A wall of cold air that knocked me backward and left me gasping on the ground. When I looked up, they were standing around me in a circle. All of them, not just the family I'd seen murdered, but dozens of spirits. Men, women, children, all wearing the clothes of a century ago, all staring down at me with expressions of terrible purpose. "You can't leave," the woman said, her voice soft and sad. "Not until the debt is paid." That's when I knew I was going to die in that hollow, just like my brother Tommy had died 15 years before. Just like every Holloway man who'd come back to this place since 1894. The spirits were closing in, and the temperature was dropping so fast I could see my breath. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in darkness so complete it seemed solid. But in that darkness, I heard something that gave me hope. A radio crackling to life. Vincent, can you hear me? This is Margaret, please respond." My radio was working again, Margaret's voice cutting through the static like a lifeline. I grabbed for it with hands that were shaking from more than cold. "Margaret, I'm here, I'm in trouble." "Vincent, thank God. Your check-in is 18 hours overdue. I've got a search team mobilizing. What's your status?" I looked around at the circle of spirits surrounding me. They hadn't moved, but they were listening to every word. The woman, I could see her clearly even in the darkness, as if she was lit from within, shook her head slowly. "Margaret, listen to me carefully. I'm at the Whitlock settlement, and I need you to pull the historical records on Jacob Holloway. My great-grandfather, October 1894. Check the sheriff's records, the newspaper archives, anything you can find." "Vincent, what's wrong? You sound, just do it, please. I'll explain when I get back, but I need that information now." There was a pause, then Margaret's voice came back, professional and concerned. "Vincent, I'm looking at your file right here. Jacob Holloway, your great-grandfather, was investigated in connection with the destruction of the Whitlock settlement in October 1894. No charges were filed, but there were witness statements. Several families of mixed-race heritage, Melungeon families, were murdered by a group calling themselves the Purity Brigade. Jacob Holloway was named as one of the leaders. The circle of spirits drew closer, and I could feel their cold breath on my skin. But they weren't attacking. They were listening, waiting to hear if the truth would finally be told. "Keep reading," I whispered into the radio. The murders were covered up by local authorities. The settlement was burned, the bodies buried in unmarked graves. Official cause of death was listed as typhoid fever. Vincent, are you telling me this is real? That you've found evidence?" I looked up at the family standing around me. The man nodded slowly, encouraging me to continue. "Margaret, I've seen them. The murdered families. They're still here, still waiting for someone to acknowledge what was done to them. My family was part of it, and they won't let me leave until..." I paused, understanding flooding through me. "Until I make it right." The woman stepped forward then, and when she spoke, her words came through my radio, as well as through the air around me. "We don't want revenge," she said, her voice achingly sad. "We just want to be remembered. We want our children to have names on their graves. We want the truth to be told." I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. The circle of spirits remained around me, but they stepped back, giving me room. For the first time since I'd arrived in the hollow, I didn't feel like prey. "Margaret, are you hearing this?" "I'm hearing you, Vincent, just you. But I'm recording everything. What do you need me to do?" I looked around at the faces surrounding me, men, women, children who had died for no crime other than the color of their skin and their refusal to abandon their ancestral land. They'd been waiting here for more than 80 years, holding vigil over their unmarked graves, making sure their stories weren't completely forgotten. I need you to contact the state archaeologist. I need you to get the Forest Service historians involved. This site needs to be properly investigated, and these people need to be properly buried. With names, with dignity. The man who had spoken first, the father of the murdered family, stepped closer. And the truth needs to be told. All of it. What was done here, and who did it? I nodded, understanding what he meant. Margaret, I'm going to write a full report when I get back. Everything I've witnessed, everything I've learned about my family's involvement, it needs to be part of the official record. Vincent, you're talking about accusations against your own family. Are you sure about this? I thought about my brother Tommy, about the hunting accident that had killed him 15 years ago in these same woods. Had he come here? Had he learned the truth about our great-grandfather and tried to cover it up? Or had he tried to do what I was doing now and paid for it with his life? I'm sure, I said. Some debts pass through generations, Margaret, but they don't have to. The temperature around me began to rise. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on the hollow since I'd arrived started to lift. And one by one, the spirits began to fade, not disappearing, but becoming translucent, peaceful. But the woman remained solid, real. She walked over to me and placed a hand on my arm. Her touch was warm, human, alive. Thank you, she said. But there's one more thing. The graves need to be blessed by someone who knew them, someone who understands what they meant to each other. I looked around at the cemetery, at the unmarked graves and broken headstones. I don't know how. You do, she said. You have your great-grandfather's memories. They're in your blood, in your dreams. You know our names, our stories. You just have to remember. She was right. As soon as she said it, I could feel the memories stirring. Not my memories, but inherited ones, passed down through generations of guilty dreams. Names and faces, stories and relationships, all the human details that had been erased by hatred and fear. I walked to the first grave, and the name came to me. Thomas Whitlock, age 34, husband and father. I moved to the next. Mary Whitlock, aged 31, beloved wife and mother. And the next? Sarah Morrison, aged 7, daughter of the heart. As I spoke each name aloud, I could feel the spirits relaxing, finding peace. The woman Mary Whitlock walked beside me, smiling as I remembered her children, her parents, her neighbors, all the people who had lived and loved and died in this remote hollow, whose only crime had been existing. When I finished the last grave, the hollow was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. Peaceful, restful, complete. Mary Whitlock faced me one last time. The debt is paid, she said, but remember there are others. Other places, other families, other secrets that need to be brought to light. The mountains remember everything. Then she was gone, and I was alone with my radio and the sound of Margaret's voice calling my name. I hiked out the next morning, my pack feeling lighter than it had in days. The trail that had seemed so oppressive, and watching was just a trail. Again, beautiful mountain country that sang with bird calls and rustled with small animals going about their business. Margaret was waiting for me at the trailhead with a thermos of coffee and 1,000 questions. I told her everything, knowing how crazy it would sound, knowing she'd probably order a psychological evaluation. But she listened to every word, took notes, and when I was finished, she just nodded. "We'll start the paperwork today," she said. "Historical site designation, archaeological survey, proper burial protocols. It'll take time, but we'll make it happen." The state archaeologist arrived 2 weeks later with a team of graduate students and ground-penetrating radar. They found 37 bodies in unmarked graves, men, women, and children who had been shot and buried where they fell. The newspaper called it one of the most significant historical discoveries in Virginia history. They didn't call it murder, of course. The headlines used words like tragedy and unfortunate incident. But the truth was there in the archaeological report, in the ballistics evidence, in the witness statements Margaret had dug out of dusty courthouse files. I wrote my own report, documenting everything I'd experienced and everything I'd learned about my family's involvement. The Forest Service filed it as an official incident report, complete with my recommendations for memorial services and historical interpretation. My supervisor thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but Margaret backed me up, and eventually, the bureaucracy ground into motion. The memorial service was held on a crisp day in November. About 50 people showed up, descendants of the murdered families, local historians, Forest Service personnel, and a few folks who'd just heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. We read the names of the dead, placed flowers on their graves, and dedicated a small monument that told their true story. I felt them there during the service, Mary Whitlock and her family, Thomas Morrison and his children, all the others whose names I'd remembered that night in the hollow. But they felt different now, peaceful, complete, ready to rest. After the service, Margaret and I walked back to the old settlement site. The foundations were still there, but they looked different somehow. Less like ruins and more like history, a place where people had lived and loved and tried to build something good. So what now? Margaret asked. Back to regular ranger duties? I thought about what Mary Whitlock had said that last night about other places, other families, other secrets waiting to be brought to light. In my 19 years as a ranger, I'd covered thousands of square miles of wilderness. How many other stories were hidden in these mountains? How many other families were waiting for someone to remember their names? Margaret, I said, how many other incident reports do we have? Other places where campers have reported strange encounters. She gave me a look that was part worried and part knowing. Vincent, you can't investigate every ghost story in the George Washington National Forest. Maybe not, I agreed. But I can investigate the ones that need investigating, the ones where the dead are trying to tell us something important. She sighed, but she was already reaching for her radio. I'll pull the files when we get back to the office. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've investigated 4 other sites where the Forest Service has received unusual reports. 2 turned out to be nothing teenagers telling tall tales or overactive imaginations, but 2 others. Well, those are stories for another time. What I learned in the Whitlock Hollow is that the mountains really do remember everything. Every act of violence, every injustice, every life cut short before its time. And sometimes, the dead find ways to make sure those memories aren't lost forever. I'm still a forest ranger. I still pull lost hikers out of the woods, still respond to emergency calls, still write reports about bear encounters and illegal camping. But now I have another job too. I'm a witness, a rememberer, someone who listens when the dead have stories to tell. The hollow is quiet now when I visit it, which I do every few months to maintain the memorial and check on the historical markers we installed. The oppressive silence is gone, replaced by the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem. Wildlife has returned, deer tracks around the old well, bird nests in the cemetery trees, even a family of foxes that den near one of the foundation stones. But sometimes, on still evenings when the mist rises from the creek, I catch glimpses of them. Not the tormented spirits I first encountered, but peaceful figures going about their daily lives. Mary Whitlock hanging laundry that isn't there. Children playing games around graves that are no longer sources of sorrow. They're not trapped anymore, they're just home. The most important thing I learned is that some stories are too big to stay buried forever. The truth has a way of working itself to the surface, like water finding its way through limestone. It might take decades, even centuries, but eventually, someone will come along who's willing to listen. Margaret retired last spring, but before she left, she made sure I was assigned to a new position, Historical Sites Coordinator for the entire George Washington National Forest. It's not an official title that appears on any organizational chart, but it gives me the authority to investigate cultural resource anomalies anywhere in our jurisdiction. I've got 7 active cases now. 7 places where the past is trying to speak to the present, where families like the Whitlocks are waiting for someone to remember their names and tell their stories. The work is hard, sometimes heartbreaking, and it's changed me in ways I'm still figuring out. I sleep differently now, dream differently. Sometimes I wake up with memories that aren't mine, fragments of other lives, other times, other tragedies that need to be addressed. My wife says I talk in my sleep sometimes, using names and words she doesn't recognize. She worries about me, and I don't blame her. But I also wake up some mornings with a sense of purpose I never had before. This work, bringing peace to the restless dead, Making sure forgotten families are remembered, it feels like what I was meant to do. Like everything in my life led me to that hollow on that October night when Mary Whitlock reached across a century of injustice to ask for help. I keep a photo on my desk now, taken by the state archaeologist during the excavation. It shows the Whitlock family cemetery with all 37 graves properly marked, each headstone bearing a name and dates and a simple inscription. Remembered. Sometimes visitors ask me about the memorial, about the story behind it. I tell them what I can, what's documented in the official reports. But I don't tell them about the nights I still spend in remote hollows, listening for voices that need to be heard. I don't tell them about the dreams, or the inherited memories, or the way the dead sometimes reach out to the living when justice has been too long delayed. Some stories are too strange for daylight, but that doesn't make them any less true. The mountains remember everything, and now, so do I. Last week, I got a call from a hiker who'd spent the night near Bearwallow Ridge, about 15 miles north of the Whitlock Hollow. He reported seeing a woman in white walking among the trees, calling out a name he couldn't quite catch. Said she seemed to be looking for something, or someone. I'm heading up there next week to investigate. I've learned to trust these reports, to understand that when the dead make themselves known to the living, there's always a reason. The work continues, the stories wait to be told. And somewhere in these ancient mountains, other families like the Whitlocks are hoping that someday, someone will come along who's willing to listen. Someone who understands that the dead of the past doesn't have to define the future, but it does have to be acknowledged. Someone who knows that sometimes the only way to find peace is to remember those who were forgotten. My name is Vincent Holloway, and I'm still a forest ranger after 22 years. But now I'm something else too, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. A voice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. And I wouldn't trade this job for anything, because in the end, we're all just stories waiting to be told. The lucky ones get to tell their own. The rest have to wait for someone like me to come along and listen to what the mountains remember. The Hollow Watchers taught me that. They taught me that some debts really do pass through generations. But they also taught me that those debts can be paid with truth, with acknowledgement, with the simple act of remembering. And in these mountains where I've spent my life, where my family has lived for 4 generations, where the past and present intertwine like morning mist through the trees, remembering is the most important work any of us can do. The dead are counting on it.